the that
Ready?
yeah, I'm
You're going to go
yeah,
without him?
yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Hold on.
Are we there yet or not?
There now.
Okay. Oh, there we are. Excellent. No, look at me here, not there. All right. We are back. We are back, and my guests are lining up out the door looking for fame and fortune. You can't imagine how embarrassing and awkward it is the way they're begging me to be on this show. Begging. I quit doing it for a while because I've realized nobody wanted to hear what I had to say, but then I realized I'm not the guest. It's not me they don't care about. Everyone loves me. It's the guest that they can't stand.
You should quit your day job and become a comedian.
Oh, I'm sure that's exactly what both people that watch this think. We're glad you're both here. Welcome back to the Freeborn Podcast. We're here again with Danny Dalros, one of my best friends.
The jokes are rolling. They keep on coming.
We're going to talk about biblical types, and Danny's going to set me straight. I promise to be super, super nice. So if any of you are angry because I'm not dropping the hammer, I made a solemn pledge to be very, very nice and not to be mean about this.
He wants to talk about things he disagrees with.
That is true. It's so boring to talk about things I agree with.
Right.
No, but I am very, very interested in this. And, my granddad was always preach types, Dale.
Right.
Dale West. I mean, he
Right.
always, that was his thing, constant types. And when I was young, I always wanted to imitate him, so I did a little.
Really?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Really?
Yes.
The same ones or to you, new ones?
It's hard to remember now. I would imagine that I pilfered his sermons.
Beg, borrow, and steal.
Yeah.
Well, see, I try doing the same thing now with you. So now when I stand up, I say types are of the devil. just so that I imitate my father.
You're imitating. That's hilarious. That's good stuff.
So I'm not completely without experience or in it.
Yeah, but you're definitely not convinced.
I have some serious reservations.
Good.
That I want to explore with you.
Kick around.
Because I mean, I don't want to take from what you're going to say because I don't know much about this, and I certainly haven't done it in any serious way in maturity. But to me, it's obvious that the biblical authors viewed the scriptures as being shadows and types of things to come, and that to me, that's just unavoidable. I mean, it says it, right?
Right.
So it's like rats. Why did you write that?
If I could just get rid of those few verses.
Yeah, it's just like
Those 30 some odd.
yeah. So I mean that to me. So that's the conflict I have, and yet then I have a lot of reservations about them in practice. In theory, not so much, because like I say, I read them, and it's like Paul especially. deals with the shadows and of things to come, and the types, and these things are written for our learning and admonition. And then you have to wonder, what is all this Old Testament for? I mean, what's that about? What's that crazy Leviticus about?
Love it.
or even, books like Esther and things like, what are these for? And so it almost seems like that they're like, that would have to have a part for them to be somehow truly meaningful, it would seem. But then I have my reservations. So
growing up, did you just sit back and like, oh, here he goes again?
No. As soon as I came to what I would call age of reason, then my reason kicked in, and I could not figure out any viable way to make them work.
And by making them work, what do you mean by that? Like when you walk out the door, at the job, or in your mind?
No. Yeah, I mean, to square them with anything that could be considered real. My difficulty feels like I'm on Oprah.
See, I don't have any notes. I just have questions.
And you get a car. So I expect Danny to start saying. So my particular OCD level is that I need everything to square with what I see as reality. So it has to be real. I don't care how good something sounds, how it makes someone feel, or how it makes me feel. All I care about is if it's true. That's why I'm terrible at preaching funerals. Terry has basically banned me from preaching in funerals because I went to a funeral. I won't say who because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but a person in one of our churches asked me to preach their funeral, their wife's funeral. What a disaster. And what a disaster.
He's not wrong. It was horrible. It was the worst thing I've ever heard.
That's being kind.
That's me being generous. I don't want to hurt his feelings.
Oh, no, of course not. Surely not. No, it was real bad. But to me, what makes things better for me is something that's true and real, not something that's feel good. Anyway, so yeah, people were like wailing when I got done. I mean, imagine that you go to a funeral where the wife, mother, grandmother has died, and you say something that makes them feel worse. And they're like, in the middle of the message, they were like, I could hear people go, ah! And she was saved. I wasn't even like saying she was on her way to hell. It's terrible.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Weddings are the same. I don't do weddings
that's hilarious.
Because I just make everyone feel just like they should just all go get a divorce. Anyway. So the problem is like how to make sure that what you're saying really squares with reality in doctrine, reality in practice and experience. And that's just extraordinarily hard for me to figure out how I can be sure that what I'm saying lines up with reality. 100%, no doubt, this is real. Mm-hmm. That's real hard for me. That's my challenge. Now, I don't put that on anyone else. I don't know anyone else thinks that way. But when I'm just... So my whole life, I don't know if prided myself is the right word I would want to use, but gets the point across.
Probably not.
But I tell people what I think is true. I may not always be right, but I am never telling them anything that I have any doubt on at all, any doubt whatsoever that is true and not just true in the sense that I'm not lying to them, right? But that I have really put some research into it, and this lines up with every point of data I can find. Well, I have a hard time doing that with types. Not that I think they're wrong, just that I don't know how can I assure myself and anyone listening to me that when I say this is a type of that, what's the methodology? Mm-hmm. How do you prove that? How do you know that? I liken types to like people to like what everyone around the world and throughout history has done. They look up at clouds and they see animals, right? And everybody looks at clouds and everyone sees animals, but nobody's ever discovered a new animal by looking at clouds. They only see what they already know. Yeah. You don't see what you don't know. So that worries me. That concerns me. It's like I can see that type there, but I know that. I'm looking for that. I'm looking for Jesus there. I'm
Right.
looking for the crucifixion. I'm looking for the resurrection. I'm looking for those things. I've never myself heard a message on types where it's like, I think that they actually went there and discovered something. So I wonder, are they pulling? Is that what types are? You go and you reach into the suitcase and you drag it back over to the old and then just like fold it out on top? I mean, I don't know. It's kind of, that's how it seems to me. But you tell me.
Do you even still want to talk about types? You just want to go home?
No. Well, yeah, it's. So where do you start, right? Where do you want to begin? So
You PC. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of. So I'm listening to a sermon last Sunday morning, and the sermon begins in Matthew 12. And it's like Jesus who's talking, and he says, "Oh, an evil and adulterous generation," and so then he goes back and he pulls out of Jonah the idea of him. He's going to be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so a lot of people would say, "Aha, they would go back to not when Jonah's on the boat. That's chapter 1." And not when he gets spit out of the fish or whale, and goes preach. That's chapter 3. But specifically, Jonah chapter 2 is that picture of Jesus being in the heart of the earth. So he identifies that as like what people might say is a type. Of course, that word is not used, right? Shadows, figures. But I don't know where we got to come up with that word, type. Why didn't we just call them examples? I don't know. I don't know the etymology of.
But don't you think that type is more is something more than just an example? That we use a word like that.
Probably.
Etymologically is why we're using it. But it seems to me that and maybe we see types differently. You have to tell me where you see it. So I've always understood types to be something far deeper than just an example of something.
Right.
Something that has like a moral lesson towards
and
that.
even more than moral lesson. I mean, it was Jonah's real life, but now because of what Jesus said, now it's got a much greater application at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes back and he says, "Well, this is a picture of me." Well, that must have just turned everybody's head on itself. They would have been like, because notice who he's talking to. Super familiar with that portion of the Bible, and they're just like, "What? What are you talking about? You telling me that this story is much more than a story?" So I think it's more than just an example. And I think it's much deeper, no pun intended, as far as the whale going down in the water.
No, I got the pun. No pun intended. He says that, and then he explains the pun. No pun intended. You get it? The whale going deep.
Yeah. So let's assume for the moment that is a legitimate, quote unquote, type.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that it foreshadowed something yet to come. Okay. And I understand the argument. So we got the reality now. So we don't. Yeah, but is it possible that? And this is, you asked me, what's your fascination? What's your?
I think I said obsession.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you said your OCD or CDO.
No, I definitely.
Is it CDO because the numbers aren't?
Yeah,
in order?
I got to get the letters in order.
So what's your personal interest? What drives somebody to maybe look at these? And so I had the thought, okay, so I don't need Jonah chapter 2 to tell me that Jesus was 3 days somewhere after he died. I can look at the reality.
Mm-hmm.
But is it possible that I could glean from Jonah chapter 2 things that the Gospels and the New Testament don't talk about? Is that possible? Oh, now I'm interested.
Mm-hmm.
Because where are the verses in the New Testament? Like if you look at some of the expressions and the language in Jonah chapter 2, and I guess this is the reservation that you would have. When Jonah says, "Out of the belly of hell I cried," is that just Jonah's experience, or
Is it prophetic?
yeah. Now, some of the anguish that he experienced, is that actually, a foreshadow of some of the things that the New Testament doesn't tell us anything about that Jesus experienced?
That would be very similar discussion, right? As far as like the Psalms, where David
Yeah,
cries out from caves and things similarly,
right.
and is appropriated in the New Testament to speak of Christ.
Yeah. But it only goes so far in the New Testament.
Correct.
So was he in anguish those 3 days when he was in the heart of the earth?
Christ.
Yes. I know Jonah was, right, in the belly of this whale.
Mm-hmm.
But if the picture as identified by Jesus was there not just for Jonah's sake, but as a picture of the Lord, all right, well, where does that picture end?
Well, see, that's my difficulty, right? Where does it end?
Right.
Because I've heard a lot of preaching on types, especially pertaining to Christ, where sooner or later they have to like end it because
Correct.
all of a sudden it's now saying something that does not seem appropriate.
Yes.
And all of a sudden now the type switch. And so that's difficult for me when we're saying, well, when we say like Joseph is a type of Christ, but not here.
Right.
Or so-and-so is a type of Christ, but not at this moment.
Correct.
Here, but not here, but now here.
Right.
Okay, so basically they're finding in it what they want to. See, that's my difficulty.
I would agree. That is a
They're
problem.
not, to me, if I say this is a type of that, then everything there has to be
I guess it would go
consistent.
to I guess it would go to your definition of a type. And then there is no definition. There isn't anything anywhere that a set of rules and regulations that would be universally accepted that solves all of these issues. There isn't. It's like Joseph. Yeah, he's exalted, and then he dies. Well, how's that square? How does that fit? Or what were some of the other ones? Like, I don't know. I can't think of off the top.
Well,
of my head.
you have like the tabernacle, right?
Okay.
And as a often used as a type of different things. Different people use it as. That's another thing, though. See, that's like, well, is it a type of Christ, or is it a type of the church, or is it a type
of the believer?
Yeah. What is this? I mean, what exactly is it? Seems like it seems like types are like the wild card in Uno, right? You can just play it in. It's like bam, like hey,
boom, mic drop, drop the mic. Whatever, however it is, right? It is, and it's like the wild, wild west.
Yeah,
it's like you can say anything about anything, and expect it to be accepted by whoever's listening to you. And this is, I think, what you're trying to get to today. Is there a guideline, a set of rules, that would be
right? Is there a methodology by which we can look at something and say, this could be a type. We're going to test it. Here's how we can test it.
Right.
And when we see it is a type, then this is the rules that has to follow. To me, it's kind of like, I've been doing some research on this because of some debates I've been having on the parables. So the parables of Christ are not, and you know this, but the parables of Christ are not like Aesop's fables or any of the older genre of parables that existed in the literary world before Christ. He took the parable and he made it something very unique, where it has a very, very consistent and defined meaning. So when you look at a parable of Christ, the elements are consistent. The birds in one parable are the same birds in another parable.
Yeah.
They're not switching around. That's not angels in one and demons in another. Like they're consistent.
Yeah, the seed is the word. Yeah.
That's right. It's a word. The sower's always is, that's the Son of Man. It's the servants are the angels. It's the same thing. The sons are the children of Israel. It's just he used these patterns, these elements, and he used them very consistently on purpose. And he himself says in the parable of the sower, if you know this parable, you can know all the parables. Or he said it in the negative.
Right.
If you don't know this, how can you know all the parables? Yeah. Which is, he gives us that key, right? So we have a key, and we can unlock them, and we can figure out the stuff that he said, specifically said it that way to hide it from a lot of people, and to only reveal it to those who got the key. And so with the parables, anyone can take those. You don't have to go to the special parable school, right, to get to be able to understand it that way.
Parable CD.
Yes, no.
Download the.
That's right. You don't have to download the parable key.
Pay me $100 and I'll.
Yes, exactly. And so that's how that when we look at the parables, that's how that is. But I don't find any key to the types.
Right.
It just seems that however you understand doctrine, you can go find types to
It's
back
problematic.
them up.
And yet, at the same time, you see some of these things that the writers of the New Testament did, and you're like, how? What? Where did that come from?
Yeah.
It's like, how would we have ever known? And then I think that plants the thought, like, well, if Paul said that muzzling the ox was written for our sakes altogether, I wonder if there's a bunch of other things that he just, and because I guess he could have quoted the entire Old Testament in the New, and then we wouldn't be having that discussion.
That's a very interesting point. It's a little off topic
Right,
on this,
right. It's not a type per se.
Yeah, but it's very interesting, the whole idea, because I've actually having this discussion similar to that, and like that passage and others like that right now. So I'll get your take on that. Most people don't know this about me, but I really hate proof text and verse numberings. This is big reveal day right now. Revelation.
He's like, oh my, here we go again.
Here we go again. What?
We'll never get back to the basic question.
What?
Nothing. Yeah. First time I've ever heard that.
Yeah. He was just dumbfounded. He was like, "What? Why am I not hearing about this?"
Caught me off guard. Wasn't
Good thing you're sitting down.
Caught me off guard.
A piece of bread, my blood pressure lowered. Surprise. Got me all.
So you don't like proof text?
I do not like proof text. I hate proof text. And so I was recently fielded a question on that. I did like a live stream at a church, like a virtual conference, and they had like a question and answer session. And somebody I had mentioned I didn't like them. I tend to do that a lot apparently. And they asked me. They said, "Well, what about when the apostles quote the scriptures? They quote a small portion and then they make points. Isn't that proof texting?" Now, to me, that's not proof texting. This goes to what you're saying. So what I see the apostles did when they're writings is that they would quote these fragments, little phrase, few words, right?
Right.
Today, like Hebrews, Paul just uses the one word, today. When it says today, and he goes on that, right? But in all of those, or practically all of those that I've looked at carefully, it seems to me that what they're doing is they are referencing a literature. They're referencing a body of literature. They didn't have chapter numbers or verse numbers then, which proves that I'm right? Because the apostles were against it. It's apostolic, what I'm talking about.
To be against
Yes, to be against it is apostolic. Yes, they did not have it. Hey.
And you're against types? No, I'm with you. I'm okay.
So what I think they're doing, and I see, and not just because I want it to be, but I really have done a lot of research into this of how they're quoting the scriptures, and it seems to me that it's very clear what they're doing is they will quote a very short fragment to bring to your mind. If you're a student of the Old Testament that they're quoting, then they are bringing to your mind that entire passage of Scripture. Because if you go back and you look, it's not just that one phrase that is dealing with their subject. And often it's that phrase isn't even perhaps the most pertinent part, but it's a part that they can quote and bring into their writing the weight of all that literature to bear. So that. But that's what Jesus said, right? About being the scribe that's trained in the kingdom, that you bring old and you bring the new. And so they're bringing in, but I don't think they're just going like proof text. Proof texting is where you have this one fragment that has no bearing in context, it doesn't matter what the context says, that's your proof, that fragment, not the context that it comes from and it represents it in shorthand. That's not what that. So when I'm talking about proof texting being against it, it's not that you can't ever quote a passage or a small verse or whatever.
Of course not.
But it must be in context. If what I'm trying to prove from this fragment of a sentence is not the context, isn't what the context is talking about at all, and it even often is against the context, that's proof texting. That's what I'm against. Doing what they were doing, where they say, remember when it says this, and you kind of maybe even paraphrase it like they often did, and
Right.
you're like, okay, now I remember that whole text, that whole discussion in Leviticus, or that whole psalm, or that whatever it is. I remember that whole thing. Oh, and you got all of the weight of that literature. It's for that type of quotation for me is for the studious person, and proof texting is for the lazy person.
Okay.
So when you say, how are they going to quote the whole Old Testament? Well, obviously they can't do that. So what do? I think they shorthand it. They say, remember Jonah in the belly of the whale? Remember David over here? Remember what so-and-so said here? And it's not just remember this phrase. It's, okay, all of that. Now think of it in this way. Here's a way to look at all that.
Okay.
And to put it all together, which means needing to have that knowledge, or in our case, we can just go back and reference it.
Right,
But go back
right.
and really read, not just that verse. Go back and read the whole psalm, right?
The whole story.
Like the ones that the psalms that are quoted talking of Christ. You shouldn't just go read that one verse, that one little fragment that's quoted. I think you're intended to go back and read the entire context, which might be the whole psalm. It might be a series of psalms
Right.
that deal with that subject, that go through, and it's like a little, series that it was written on that thing. You go through and you look at it and go, okay, I'm starting to understand how they're viewing this and which context they're seeing it.
All right. That's still, and maybe that kind of makes the point of Jonah chapter 2. And so it's like, okay, so if I understand the whole story of Jonah, then what I understand you're saying is that, okay, he's just not talking about time. He's talking about everything. And so maybe some of my fascination is like, are the emotions expressed in Jonah chapter 2? Yeah, specifically Jesus, he could have quoted, and then Jonah was this, and then the men took him up, and then the weeds, but he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
All he talks about is the time. So the dilemma would be, do I only apply the time frame, which is kind of the opposite of what you just said? Do I now go beyond the time frame and say, okay, so when Jesus said this is a sign, yes, he mentioned days, but now can I look at the entire body of that event and say, oh, now I have things that are telling me about what Jesus experienced, and the New Testament doesn't say that.
But how and this is a personal answer. I'm not not for you to answer for like universally for anyone else, but for yourself. How confident could you go? Let's say take Jonah's as example, and go and grab some detail, the seaweed wrapped around his head, and make application in the church. See, that's where I have a real problem. I can't do that. I can't see any way I could say this
means that.
Yeah, means this. This is meaningful in this way. I'm like very limited to say, and here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting about that particular example. So I have a friend who doesn't think that the time frame is what Christ was actually referencing. Because he can't calculate those 3 days and 3 nights. He's done this huge, extensive study on what day Christ died, right, of the week. And he's like on Friday. He's not Catholic, but he's like on Friday, which then is to Sunday morning. There's like no math that makes that 3 days and 3 nights.
Right.
And so then his problem is that one passage, right? When Jesus says that. So he is basically, I think, kind of gone to like a type and said, this is typology, and the 3 days and 3 nights aren't literal, is what he's gone to.
I guess he can do that.
See, that's our problem with types. It's like, and he's like,
I respect him for it. Like,
Yeah. Well, there are things, and I think of it as maybe like a continuum. It's like, okay, it's like when Paul, here's my proof text. When Paul said, I was a child and I acted, I talked, but then, right, I grew up. Okay, so if I look at a passage like Jonah chapter 2, I can look at it and I can see his anguish pretty easily. To just mentally imagine, which is impossible, to be like inside of with the gastric juices and everything. And okay, that I can kind of grasp, and I'm like, okay, I could understand why physically he would say, boy, this is like hell. And I can take that and apply it to the Lord and say, like, boy, what he did, the death of the cross, I think there was a part of redemption that was accomplished because he said so. But obviously, the entire work wasn't finished. Don't mishear me, right? But what he had to do, things that had to be accomplished, like, and he tells me, don't touch me yet. What does that mean? It means he went and preached to the captives. So when he died, that wasn't the end of everything that was going to be accomplished. Okay, so if I look at what Jonah said and said, okay, there was more that was going to be, that he was going to go through. Do I understand everything? No. But I can confidently say there was more to be done once he quit breathing. Okay. Can I understand everything? No. What did I understand with weeds wrapped around his head? Do I know what that means? No. But I don't know that negates everything that I do understand. So as a kid, you can pick up some things, but you don't understand everything. You can say, yeah, this is my home, but you don't know anything about the electric bill,
Right.
fixing the sewer line that's broken. And so until you mature, and now you can see a bigger picture as you get older. And I think types are they can be progressive like that. Some things I think are really clear. We do know that Jesus was dead for a certain period of time. You can argue about how much is a day defined. Okay, I personally don't worry about those types of things. Right. You want to pick a day? I'll pick a different day, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I do think there are things to be gleaned that can benefit me as a believer, that makes me appreciate the Lord Jesus more. When I understand more of the anguish that he went through for me, I'm like, and that's expressed in the early verses, half of the chapter of Jonah chapter 2. I'm like, okay. And that's what attracts me. When I can have a fuller, more appreciation of what Jesus went through, not just as a sacrifice, but as in his being a son, him being a man, him accomplishing the will of his Father, him being exalted. Okay, now I get a bigger picture of him. Then I'm like, oh, that's cool. I think cool is kind of a lame word, but I can't think of a better one right now. It's not just fascinating, but it magnifies him. He's more majestic, and then I'm like, okay, I grow from that. I can appreciate that, but there is still a danger. And I appreciate the reservations and the danger, because now it's like, well, a bird flew into the tree. Whoa, it's a type. I'm not a hyper.
You're not a hyper typologist?
I am not. And it's like, I want to ask somebody, how do you know this?
Well, that's what I want to ask every time I hear anybody speak of types.
Right.
Even ones that are dealt with in the New Testament. Because generally they're going beyond what the New Testament author is using, right? They're taking that and saying, okay, we know this is a type, like Jonah. We know this is a type. So now we can go back and we can look for things. And so my question is one, how do you know what you're saying? I mean, how can you know that? It's like to me, it's like what John says it writes in 1 John. 1 John is the most philosophical book in the New Testament, in my opinion. John deals with how we know what we know, right? The epistemology of knowledge. And so that's kind of my question there, same as him, is like, okay, I know you know that, but how do you know that you know that, right? Let's back up a step. How do you know that you know that? And I generally can't get a satisfactory answer on that, other than to say, well, I looked at the New Testament and it talked about these things, and I look over here and it looks like it's parallel, and it's like, well, then what's the point? I mean, you read it in the New Testament. I say you, the person reads in the New Testament and understood something, and now they will go back, they put it in reverse, and they go back into the old, and they're saying, now we're finding it here. I'm like, no, you're carting it in, you're wheelbarrowing that in.
Yeah.
From somewhere else.
Yeah.
If you hadn't have found it over there, you never would have come back and said you see it here.
Right.
So then are you really seeing it there? Or are you just bringing in a filter and everything you look at looks like that because you're looking for it? Again, it's like looking up at the clouds. You see an elephant. Well, do we think that the cloud was designed to look like an elephant? That it was like predestined to look like an elephant? I don't think so. I think if you never would have known what an elephant was, it would just look like a cloud. Or it'd look like a giraffe, or it'd look like a bug, or it'd look like whatever you knew, right? We see patterns of things we know, and it's extraordinarily difficult for us to see patterns that we're not aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. I think everybody's experienced that. You've read the scriptures, and then there's a morning where like, I never saw that before. There's this knowing that comes into focus. So that's experiential maturity. You may not know what to call it. Like if you've never seen an elephant before, you'd be like, you could clearly say, that doesn't look like any other cloud I've ever seen before.
I don't know that anyone's ever said that.
But you
You could, okay. I just don't think anyone's ever looked at a cloud and went, we need to go find the animal that looks like that. See it? Draw it down, Tom. It's right there. See that? We're gonna go find that.
It's like when we lived in the Springs, because of the mountains, clouds. I saw clouds that we'd never seen before. Lenticular, I think is what they call them. And I'm like, what? I don't know what to call it, but that is different. Well, it was, just the atmospheric differences and
right. But did you ever think that maybe you were discovering a new genus of animal in them?
No.
You're like, what should we call that animal? No, that's my point.
I'm going to put a copyright on that.
Yeah, it's like
money
we're
on
going to
it.
go on safari. There's an animal somewhere in the world that looks like that cloud. I don't think so. I don't think anyone's ever discovered a new species by cloud gazing. You just see the ones you already know. And that's my difficulty with, because this ties into, I mean, if it were isolated, I wouldn't have as much of a problem. But to me, it ties into what I think is the serious problem with evangelical preaching. And that is that they talk about the things they know exclusively. I say they, I'm just speaking generally, right?
Yeah,
just generically, pretty much myself and pretty much all evangelicals that I've been in, Baptists and Methodist, I've been to a lot of churches, hear preach, and when I hear most preaching, I think that is a sermon that seems to me to have been prepared before you ever read a passage. Mm-hmm. This is the way, and I taught many preaching classes, so I'm telling you out of somewhat of experience, this is how most sermons, in my opinion, get prepared. The preacher thinks about what he wants to say. And then he goes and finds passages, texts that say what he wants to say. And lo and behold, passages are found.
Yes.
To say what they want to say. And the worst variation of that method is what they call problem solution sermons. There's actually a name for it in preaching literature or in homiletic literature called problem solution sermons, and that you look around and say, who has a problem that I can solve? Right? And so you're looking around, who has a sin, who has a fault, who has a problem, who's a problem, and I can solve it. And so then you're just tailoring sermons to the problems you see, as opposed to studying the text and saying, I'm going to take this text of scripture and I'm going to try to figure out what it's telling me, what it's saying, what the author intended to say. Now, I don't think that's the only legitimate interpretation of scripture. just what the author, his primary focus was.
Right.
But surely we need to start there.
Certainly needs to be considered as
Well, I think it has to be
major
as the starting point.
Yeah.
Because I can see, even though I'm more reluctant, but I can see how a text of scripture could even have valid interpretation that wasn't even in the author's mind.
Yes.
In so much that he's speaking truth, it would be as vast and as deep as truth can be, which is infinite.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So
right.
there would be infinite application there and valid interpretation that the author might say, I never intended
Right.
that, but because if it's true and the interpretation is equally true, then it would be valid. I don't know that all the Old Testament authors intended their text to be taken the way the New Testament authors took them.
I would agree with that.
I would think that they would be like, "Oh,
Really?
I wrote that. I mean, I wrote that. I wrote that. That's what I meant. I wrote that. That's right. I wrote that.
Right. But I guess that's the nature of truth.
Correct. But then that's why it's so crucial that what's being said is true.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It actually squares with truth, with reality. Otherwise, there's infinite wrong interpretations also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's infinite wrong interpretations.
Yeah. At the same time, I understand that it's like, well, it would be impossible now for you and me to go back into the Old Testament and not, as you said, wheelbarrow what we know. It's like I can't erase what I know
Water.
and approach the Old Testament completely unbiased, completely unprepared, with no prior. I can't do that anymore. So it's like, so now what do I do?
Yeah.
I can't. And yet, because of what you just said, like for example, okay, we'll leave Jonah. But I really believe my point is valid, and not that you disagreed with it, but when he expresses some of the things that he does, I think that Jesus went through some of that stuff, and we're not told about it in the Gospels of the New Testament. But because Jesus tied that experience to himself, I'm thinking like, well, I don't know that I could
Discount it.
Yeah, only limited to. So let's go to a different one. Like, take for example, this is, I think, a commonly accepted shadow or type where you have Abraham sending out his servant to go find a wife for Isaac.
Eliezer.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about, so you would agree, right? That's probably your granddad preached on.
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's that song that we sing, and
Yeah, we got a whole song that's typology.
and there's going to be a wedding. I mean, it's like, okay. So I think generally people would say like, yeah, that's a valid one, whatever valid one means, but that's okay. That's a picture. So where in the New Testament, so this is what fascinates me about that particular story. Well, a lot of it fascinates me. Like, why in the world would she say yes when she doesn't know anything other than what the servant presents? I'll go. What? You mean you're just going to up and go? That's all fascinating to me. But where in the New Testament is this conversation at the beginning of the story that happens between Abraham and his servant? So who is this servant in this type?
Well, see, that's what I'm wondering, because I'm not sure that's a valid type. I don't particularly like the song.
Had nothing to do with singing. We know that the New Testament, right? The Apostle Paul says, like, okay, we know that there is a bride being called out today, that there are being a people taken out for his name's sake. And, well, the methodology of that is, well, we preach the gospel. Yeah, but without the working of the Spirit, you can preach all day long, and nothing is really going to be accomplished as far as the salvation of people is concerned.
So you think that the servant is a spirit?
I do. In my understanding of the type, I think, now let's just lay some groundwork.
Okay.
I agree with you that there is no perfect type. Perfect in the sense that everything about the story is going to be super easy. No, there are some problems in this thing. In every,
yeah.
all of them. But I think in general, I think you would say like, yeah, the Spirit is in the world today doing work. And you could, convincing men of sin and, using the preaching of the gospel. And all of a sudden, there's this revelation and people believe. Without seeing, they just, I will follow, I will go to him. Oh, okay. So I see that there's this conversation that takes place between the father and the servant, and I don't understand everything about it. What does it mean? Put your hand under my thigh. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
So I don't, and if I don't understand it, I can't emphatically say that means this, because you certainly don't have any verses to go on. Now, you might be able to go back into Jewish culture, but is that really what the New Testament is about? Finding some Jewish culture.
But looking at that one as a type, how does that even fit where is Isaac going and redeeming her?
Right.
I mean,
he's not in that story.
Right. So I don't get that. I don't see how that can possibly be a type.
Of what?
Of anything.
You don't see the father sending out a servant. This is real high-level verbiage to, I don't want to say procure, but...
That's fine.
Okay, a bride for his son. That isn't fit? That isn't square?
Not with what actually happened, no.
What do you mean what actually happened? Are you talking about the story or the New Testament?
I'm talking about the actual reality that we're trying to type, that we're trying to bring this shadow to and say, see, here's a shadow of what's real, right? So what's real is God the Father and the bride and all of that's the reality. The church is the bride. That's the reality.
And the Spirit.
And we're saying now here in the Spirit and all.
Yeah,
so here's the shadow. Only the reality has 5 fingers and the shadow is a foot.
No, not that bad. Not that bad. I liken it to this. If I hold my hand over a table, you can tell that it's a hand. 5 fingers, you know the dimensions. But if I turn it 90 degrees, now I'm like, well, is it still a hand? Tough to tell that from the shadow.
Well, it's like those. I don't know if you've seen those artworks where it's actual physical art, right? Not just a drawing. Actually, it's like a thing, and they'll hang a geometric object off of a string. It'll be like a cylinder, and they'll shine 2 lights at it.
Yeah.
Have you seen those? They shine one light at it, and on the shadow on the wall makes a circle.
Right.
And on the other way, it makes a square.
Yeah.
Because it's shining at a cylinder from the side, right?
Correct.
So it outlines a square. That would be to how you're seeing this.
Yeah. So you can't always tell everything about the reality by looking at the shadow. You cannot.
Okay.
But that doesn't negate what you can tell. I mean, if I hold my hand flat like this, I can tell there are 5 appendages, if you would. I may not know that they're called fingers or whatever, but it has 5. I can count them. But if I turn it and I'm like, well, how many fingers do I have now? I don't know, 20?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that I still don't have 5 fingers and it's not a hand. It is. I just, by looking at the shadow, there's some, what do you want to call it? Understanding or interpretation difficulties. So you think
that Eliezer and Abraham and all of that is a type of the work of the Spirit and the calling of the church, even though it completely goes against the work of Christ? I mean, in the reality, Christ comes, he calls the church out and leaves the Spirit to him. And then in the type, nothing of that happens.
Well, go beyond the, so let's it's like mountaintops. Okay, so I'm going to go beyond a valley or two. So in the ages past, and the New Testament doesn't really tell us this, was there some conversation that the Father had with the Spirit that says, okay, here's the plan? I don't know. But in that story, you do have that interaction. And I just think, that's interesting to me.
So what can we get out of that type that we couldn't get out of just what we know from the New Testament?
I don't think that the New Testament talks about a conversation that the Father had with the Spirit in regards to the what's
purpose.
A better word? What's the better word than procuring, the acquisition?
Well, I would consider it God's purpose God's eternal purpose with the church
Okay.
is how I look at it.
Which is many things, but part of that is a bride for his
Right.
son. Yeah.
I think that's the main thing.
Certainly.
I actually think the main thing of the church is as a bride.
the purpose
for
of the church, you
son.
mean?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
I see that as being the principal main purpose of the church.
Yeah. Well, and that goes to the problems that you said. There are segments, super important segments, that are not in every type. There are gaps. And the only way that really you know about the gaps is because of your knowledge of the New Testament. But I don't know that that automatically, it's like, oh, disqualifies that shadow in the past because it's not 100% true. You know, we've heard the analogy of people like, you know, if you have a bowl of soup and you put a fly in the soup, and well, I don't know that the fly has contaminated the entire body of soup in time, but it doesn't mean that everything is bad.
Right.
There's still some good soup. Now I may not drink it because I don't like
But isn't the challenge that the challenge to me isn't that, well, not everything fits, or there are elements that are completely different. But then I'm saying, well, then how do I know that the elements that I think fit really do? I mean, where's the point to which a type is like, okay, 90% doesn't fit, but this 10% is a type? Where's the point where you say, okay, I'm doing some eisegesis here. I'm reading into this a lot. I mean, how do we know? That's my problem. It's not that I don't think that there are types in the Old Testament. I do. I don't know how to identify them in a way that I can be sure that I'm not just reading it into it. That I can say, this was designed. Because this is the deal, what we're talking about. We're not saying, hey, wow, there's this amazing coincidence, right? That Abraham's life or Joseph's life lines up very coincidentally with that of Jesus and is very intriguing. That's not to me what a type is. A type means that it was predestined in God's mind before the foundation of the earth that this event was going to happen in a very specific, particular, designed way as prophetic of something to come.
Yeah.
That God actually orchestrated the people, the places, the events, the names.
Yeah.
Right? Everything. Everything was orchestrated to presage a future event as prophetic, as let's call it, what do they call that? Performance prophecy. We'll call it. Oh,
I'm out of my league.
That's essentially what we're saying, though, right? I mean, for it to be that meaningful. Otherwise, we're just seeing coincidences.
Yeah, no, I would agree that it's more than a coincidence. I do think that it's not just happenstance, that there is some divine design to these stories and the names and the places. I do. But I don't know that I'm going to impose my definition or understanding like, well, God, you have to do it this way. Otherwise, I don't accept it. If it's not 100%, then it's not divine. Where do I come off with the authority to lay that type of... Now, it's safe.
But where do we have the authority to say if it's
70%?
0.01%,
right.
it's okay?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my problem. It's like, it's not that I don't think that happened. I actually do. I mean, like here's a real easy one, I think, to see that that God has orchestrated things. John the Baptist, his name. Why John? Insisted that he be called John. Insisted. Why? There's got to be some reason why, right? There's got to be a purpose why. And I have some off the wall crazy ideas about it that I won't get into. But you know, it's like, why would he insist? Well, that mattered. There is some reason for God why John's name was very meaningful. And what's interesting is I don't know that there's anything in the name itself, right? Where Jesus, like, you know, what it means is
right.
like, okay, like, no brainer.
You got me on that one.
Yeah. Obviously, we're not going to call him Fred. You know. But
Nolan.
Yeah. Well, oh, don't offend the producer.
And we're no longer on you.
Cut that, Mike.
I mean, I'm in there. I'm in the book. Daniel.
So to me, that's an example of I think that it seems to me, and this is just pure opinion. I never preach it, never teach it. It's completely. I only say it on venues like this where nobody's listening, and it will immediately be forgotten by everybody who happens to be subjected to it. I'm sure that the CIA uses these recordings in their torture waterboarding. They can't use waterboarding anymore, so now they're like
Here,
put this
listen to
on.
this.
They're like, no, give me
Bring in
the water.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. But I think that in the future, prophetically, in the prophetic future coming, that John's name and why it had to be that, there'll be meaning to that. We'll say and go, oh, okay, I see that. I'm not, and again, I could be wrong, and maybe my ideas are wrong, and maybe there are other reasons, but it seems to me that was performance prophecy. God was putting listening. I'm saying, okay, smart guy. Okay, Mr. Expert.
What does this mean? How does
Okay,
that fit?
so I got 14 other details within the same 10 verses. Tell me
Right.
what those mean. Oh, I don't know.
Right.
Well, then how do you know what you're saying? That's my problem. See, that's where I'm at. It's like
Right.
I can
right.
read them, and it's almost impossible. It's like, to me, it's like looking at clouds again. It's impossible to look at them and not see something. I mean, no matter how much you know that you're reading into it, you're just seeing what you want to see. You still see it. It's still there. You still see
It is
the
there.
elephants, right? I read the Old Testament, I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. I wonder, that's strange, right?
Right.
That's odd.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems awful coincidental. But then the next verse is like, well, that doesn't fit. And that doesn't fit. And I don't know how to make that. I mean, where does that go? And it just comes to a point where I think, I don't know how I can teach this. I don't know how I can, like, I could talk about it. I could have a conversation with somebody and go, have you ever seen this? This is really interesting, isn't it? Oh, yeah, it's real cool. But, like, to get up and, to me, like, that's the big step between getting up at a pulpit, let's say, and say, here we have a type of this. And it's like, oh. Because in my mind, I'm already shooting it full of holes. So I'm just like,
Note to self: never talk about types at Freeborn. Don't do it. Don't go there.
Those, you have daggers shooting at you,
First, you're going to say it's no different from any of your other sermons.
or anybody else's for that matter. That's the thing. See, I get annoyed when people criticize types.
So you're annoyed with yourself?
I don't criticize them. I don't.
He condemns them.
You're shooting the holes, but it's not a criticism.
No, I don't.
The
have
bullet holes are they're good. They're good bullet holes.
I shoot them with love.
Oh, man.
No, I don't condemn anyone who does it. I don't think badly of them. I don't have any problem with them, per se. I don't agree. I'm like,
They just don't know what they're talking
if
about.
they could convince me, I'd love it, right? If someone said, "Hey, that's why I had you on. You're gonna convince me," and then I'm gonna start.
That's not why you're on. You're here. to
Right.
repent.
Here's a big target right here.
You're here to repent, and you're not leaving
Recant.
until that happens.
Oh, it's terrible.
It is.
But here's the thing, I hear other people who basically would like to forbid them, who just don't want them spoken, and in theory, I get where they're coming from, and yet I say, well, don't you listen to all the other sermons? They're no better, for the most part. Non-type sermons, to me, as a general rule, they're not any better. You're just saying what you want to say too.
Yeah, right.
So what's the point? Sure, in an ideal world, nobody would be speaking in types in my ideal world, right? We'd all speak clearly. with evidence and data and proof and research. None of this feely, touchy stuff. You know what types are, right?
That's the problem right there.
You know what types are? They're the doctrinal version of a hug, Danny. See, that's how you don't know this, but that's your pathology coming out. You've repressed your hugging so much that now you need to verbally hug people with your types.
Hilarious. Yeah, see, I should have come in like that. Well, first of all, types are like super emotional, right? And if you're not, right, you just don't get them. And that's your problem. I like what Jesus said that one time. He says, yeah, what I'm doing now, you don't get it.
Yeah, exactly. You don't understand. Yeah, I mean, but, I just say, well, in an ideal world, maybe that's the case. But in the world we're in now, where I say everybody. I mean, I would say my personal assessment is that 70% of sermons from solid Bible teachers, I'm not talking about the wacko groups or
Right.
the crazy. I'm just talking about solid evangelical or fundamentalist Bible church, Baptist church, whatever. I would say 70%, they're just saying what they want to say. They're just saying what they want to say. Not all of it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's not true. Right. There's a lot of people hear that and they think that I'm saying it's not true. I'm not. I would say 99% of it is probably true, but it's what they want to say. They have not gone to the text and looked at the text and said, what does this say? And let me really research. Let me do some deep research into what the author's trying to express, what he's trying to say. And I just want to teach what he's trying to say. Even if it's something that's been said a million times, it might be something very simple, right? There may not be any deep meaning here that I can ferret out. It may just be a simple admonition. So I'm just going to teach that simple admonition. Yeah, that's not what's being done there. The messengers are started generally, in my opinion, thinking, what am I going to talk about tomorrow?
Yeah, I got a bone to pick
Yeah. Or something that interests me or whatever. And then they go find a text that deals with that. And it may deal with that. I'm not saying the text doesn't line up. It might, but they didn't get there because they were following the scripture. They went and found the scripture that follows their way of thinking. Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is not that it's somehow heretical or wrong. Like I said, I think most of the time it's, at least the ones I've heard, perfectly fine, true messages, probably needful. Definitely, I mean, if there's a problem solution, by definition, it's needful, okay?
Yeah.
Right. The problem with that is the speaker, the preacher, the teacher is confining himself to his knowledge. He never breaks out of that. So it's the same little cadre, the same little, what do they call it? Repertoire of things to say, because they're pulling it first out of their own mind. So you don't go anywhere beyond that.
Yeah.
And that to me is a problem.
Yeah. So what would you think about this? Let's say, because there are stories in the New Testament and Old Testament alike where you have like main characters and then you have like a supporting cast. These little, not insignificant elements or details, but certainly they're not going to get nominated for any Oscars, so to speak. They have a time and a place, but then the story moves on. But had that not been there, then there would have been some imagination that would have been needed to bridge a gap, to transport to a different time. So what do you think about this thought, that these stories, these types, these shadows, if you will, playing a supporting role as opposed to this pedestal that people have given them that says, oh, what if it's less? For example, well, any of the examples that we've used already, like Abraham and Isaac, or Jonah, or how about this one? What about this one? Let's say, because I laugh at this because I asked this in class one time up in the Springs. So here comes Moses out of the mountain. He's got the tables of stone. And he goes down there and he sees what's going on and he throws them down and breaks them. So I asked a group of kids, like high school students, I'm like, what's going on here? And there's one girl says, well, clearly, it's so 20th century. He says, well, clearly he has an anger management problem. I'm like, no, it's not got an anger management problem. What's that other one that needs a tantrum conversion therapy? No, I'm like, that's not. So when I told them what I think it meant, they were like dumbfounded. They were like, this is something that they'd never heard before.
And what's that?
That there was no ark. The tables had to be broken because there's no keeping of the law outside the ark. And they're like, what? And I said, and of course then I said, it's not per se a picture of Jesus. It's just, here's God's law that comes down in the midst of people naturally, although it breaks down right away. Like, wait a minute, these are the redeemed. These are the ones that have been delivered, right? And so it falls apart there in that picture. But the event of the law being broken in the midst of a rebellious, sinful people, and then when you get to the second set, which is like books away, they're placed into the ark up in the mountain, and then they're not broke. Well, and you tie that, Jesus kept the law. And to them, it was just like, but this idea of this law being broken, it's not like the main point, I don't think, of that story, but as a supporting role, looking at the life of Christ, made of a woman, made under the law, he keeps the law. Oh, well, now that story has meaning for me. Like I'm visual, let's say. I need a story to connect with. I mean, you could have read verses in the New Testament that said, Jesus kept the law. He fulfilled the law. Okay, he didn't break the law. Okay, I can get all that without, but when I have a physical breaking in the Old Testament, I'm like, now there's drama. Not a bad drama, right? There's a dramatic effect. But I'm just like, now it's more, I'm impacted more. I'm more teachable by seeing and experiencing it versus not. So what do you think about that supporting role of these stories?
Well, I like the idea, and I like for instance, in this particular case, your explanation there. I think that's very interesting. But I think that you got there because you understood it in the new.
Yes.
And now you see what could be a presaging of it in the old.
Yeah.
Not you went to the old and said, oh, wow, this is an interesting, and went back in the new and said, it is here. I think it's the other way around.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know that
you would ever gotten to that idea without having known the principles.
I don't think I'm that smart.
Clearly. No.
Yeah, I don't think I'm that smart.
And I don't think anybody, even in the legitimate types that I say legitimate, by that I mean the ones that were apostolically sealed, that we know this is a type because they say it is, right? Those. Yeah. Everything else is fake. No. Fake type. Fake type.
Pseudo veneer.
Yeah.
Quasi
type. No, but the actual ones that are apostolically signaled out or pointed out, I don't think anybody read those. In fact, I know they didn't. But that was the whole point. That Christ goes through the scriptures and shows, and then they're like, I mean, look at it this way.
Right.
Matthew documents that Christ taught plainly over 10 times, more than 10 times, plainly, that the Gentiles are going to be saved and believe the gospel. And not even the apostles knew until like 30 years later. Right. It took them 30 years to go, huh? What? Not 30. I guess it was about 18 years, something like that, 15 years. But anyways, I mean, this is being said plainly. No shadows. Just like the Gentiles are going to believe, and they're just like, right. Where did you get food? Who brought you food?
Right.
So I don't think anybody ever looked at the types and figured out what was coming. Just the same way with prophecy. I don't think anybody's ever looked at prophecy and figured out what's going to happen. Not even the Old Testament prophecies to the New. I think we look back at the prophecies and say, oh, wait, it was there.
Yeah. Well, hence the saying, hindsight.
It's 2020. We look back and say, oh, wait a minute, that the Messiah was going to suffer and die was actually in the prophecy. But nobody ever saw that.
I don't think they.
Not even the most believing ones saw the suffering. They all saw
Right.
directly to the glorification, to the exaltation.
Right.
And so I think I do agree with you, but then that again means that like Moses breaking the tablets, if that is the proper type interpretation of it, or something similar to what you're saying, then that means that then him breaking that was, in a sense, preordained.
Yes.
That it's not that God's saying, oh, good, good improvisation there, Mose.
I can use this. Yeah. No.
Yeah, you're working with me, like he's a director and that Moses is an actor. Then we're getting into the ideas of I don't know what is preordination and how does that all work. But I do think that the otherwise what are the points? And I realize I'm like, jumping back and forth on both sides of the issue, but what is the point of all of these stories and details in the Old Testament? I mean, over 60% of the Bible is the Old Testament, which kind of irks me, right? It's like, what is that?
I love it.
Like, what? Was Paul tired? Buck up, buddy.
Well, not everybody. So I mean, people. I mean, I spent like 26 years teaching where I worked, and it's not just philosophical mumbo jumbo that says people have different learning styles. It's true. And I mean, people could look at you and Mike and say like, boy, they different. Now, does that justify 60-40? I don't know. But, without these stories, a lot of people with the clear, the 15 times, whatever, 10 times in Matthew, they're still not going to get it. But if you can pull a story to some people, that's like, well, they say a picture's worth.
Yeah, those people have never played Pictionary.
Draw a line. On Everest. How did you get that? But it is true. I mean, people, you could talk till the cows come, you're blue in the face, and then show them a picture and they're like, got it. The truth is the same. What you're saying was true, but they just are never going to get it until they see it. I'm not playing on words there. I mean, they literally have to have a story to well, is the story everything? Is it the entire story? No, of course not. It's just, certain elements. Does that mean that the picture isn't accomplishing what it was divinely ordained to do? No, it's in the grand scheme of thing, it's heading in the right direction. But it just, if I can, and I don't think, I don't want to discredit anything by saying it's piecemealed. It's just, I mean, it's just like measured.
And so in your ideal world, how does a sermon on a type work?
Oh, that's a tough question to try to answer.
When's the last time you preached a sermon with types, where you just the whole thing, not that you referenced one, but you like did a whole sermon or series of sermons on types?
Can't remember.
So how would that go? How would that work? Because like for instance, I told you my granddad was big into that. I mean, he taught them. It would be all the time.
I think if I had to guess, and it's a bit of a guess, the last time I did it was probably at the rescue mission. Because you have men, right, who've been out, who knows, doing what all day long. They're dirty, they're tired, they're hungry, and they're going to be forced to listen to someone like me for 30 minutes. It better be entertaining.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can, and of course, I don't want to, take the place of the Spirit, but because you could be super boring and someone would be like, oh, I see. I mean, it's just like it's a mystery on how that works. But for the most part, I probably would say the rescue mission would be the last time I would go back and kind of tell the story. And then, as you say, say this is how this applies to the New Testament. I'm bringing over the New Testament reality and saying, like, see, the picture matches up with that. Not the reverse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could argue it's, you're picking points, but that's probably when I would do it. So the story of Jonah would be a classic example of something that I would say, you see the men throwing him overboard, they think they're killing him, but he really didn't die. And so just different stories would probably be, the mission. And I don't know.
So you see him being used more as a teaching tool as opposed to a doctrinal presentation.
Well, certainly they should never. I mean, the New Testament is your doctrinal base. It's the foundation. And does that mean you're building a house, you're building a building, does that mean every board, every nail is going to be correct and properly and measured in space and cut? And no. But at the end, right? So in doctrine, I think you better not violate what you know to be true from the New Testament. You got to have that parameter. And I don't know that it is wise, I guess I would say, to be overzealous towards types. The New Testament isn't.
Mm.
And so if you're looking for some parameters, which I think are wise to look for, it's like, how many times did the apostles really reference an Old Testament story?
Yeah.
What's the percentage here? Because like your dad, and I admired him, I loved him. William Taylor was another guy that I think was a huge influence on my understanding or raising up in the church. It seems like every time, and I'm like, but that's not what the New Testament did. It's not what Paul did. And so if you're looking for a balance, maybe 50-50 not even justified. How often did they do it? Not much. Okay. Maybe that's a good rule of thumb to go with it, at least initially.
Yeah.
And you need to be willing to listen to criticism. If someone with more experience, and not just one person, because you could come across someone like yourself that says, I don't know, and that's good, and kind of balance that with someone else's like, yeah, sick 'em, go get 'em. So you need to be willing to listen to criticism, and because you definitely don't want to get backed into a corner and then look the fool when someone says like you would do or I would do and say like, yeah, but how does that square with this next verse?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's always legitimate unless you preface it to say, well, that just doesn't fit, right? Types are not perfect, right? You need to express that. You need to understand that. Because I don't know that I know of a perfect type.
Well, I don't either. That's a big problem. There's not like with the parables, like I was saying, you can take the parable of the sower and you can always go back to there and say, because he explains it like every single detail has a meaning in the parable of the sower. There's none of them where he's like, hey, parables aren't perfect.
You got to go with the gist.
Yeah, come on. No, every single element has a specific meaning, every single one. Which is, that all comes in because I'm having these debates on Luke 16 and Lazarus and the rich man. And those that want to teach soul sleep, well, their big thing is, well, this is a parable.
Right.
And it's like, how is this a parable? There's not a single element in the parable that is in any parable. And they can't ever, and I have a list. I wrote it down. I took every element out of it, wrote it down a list. I'm like, tell me what any of these mean. Well, they don't have any answer for not one element, not one. They can't even say, well, this would mean this. It's like, what is hell? Well, that's hell. And what's fire? Well, that's fire. So this is a parable that's an exact replica of reality. Right.
It is a dilemma. I mean, I'm naturally drawn to them. I like them. This idea of shadows and stuff.
Is it because you like the idea that the Old Testament is deep and meaningful? That not that it is, but that it's apparently so.
I think it is.
I know that it is. I'm saying though, but that I think that a lot of people don't realize it.
Okay.
And that this like accentuates or highlights it.
Probably so. And that was, yeah. I was just thinking about all this stuff over the last couple of weeks. And for example, like when early on in Genesis, when the Lord is going to create, man and woman, and it says that he caused this deep sleep to come on Adam. And I'm like, And so when it says he caused it, then I'm thinking like Isaiah 53. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. I don't understand that. How in the world could I understand, doing that to your only begotten son? I don't know. I just know that these words are similar. There's a connection between the two. He caused it to happen in Genesis, and it pleased him to do it in Isaiah. And so I find, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but there's a lack of those types of words in the Gospels in the New Testament. I mean, you kind of get close when you get in the garden and Jesus says, nevertheless, but there's no voice that says, yeah, I'm going to choose nevertheless. And so to me, I find fascination and meaning. It kind of tells me things I don't understand, which is kind of weird to say, but it tells me some things about God's plan and God's character. You mean you were pleased? Maybe I don't understand the word pleased. Or you caused this to happen to your son? For at the very least, I'm going to be selfish. My benefit? Yeah, that's part of it. But there's more to it than that. I mean, there's this whole relationship in the Godhead that I don't think I understand very well. And how he's glorified and honored to cause this to happen, and for the other one to be pleased to allow it to happen. But there's like mountains of understanding and truth and all that. So I like them because they at times will share with me information that I don't find in the New.
And how worried are you that information might not be true? Does that concern you? Do you ever think maybe I need to do some due diligence and make sure that this information that's so attractive is actually true?
Yeah.
That I'm not reading it into it, that I'm not wanting it to be, I'm not misinterpreting. That's my dilemma.
That's a clear and present danger. Of course, the flip side of the same coin is like, well, am I concerned about missing something that is there? I mean, if it says he caused it or it pleased, well, I'm not going to go into that because it's like shooting at a target. Okay, there is the problem of overshooting the target, but it's the same problem as undershooting. Mm-hmm. Either way, you miss the mark.
Right.
Is one better than the other?
Yes.
I think some archery people would beg to differ on that. Right? If I raise my sights or too low. So it's a problem either way. So you could, don't take this wrong, you could criticize people for reading into, mm-hmm. and they could turn around and say they could criticize you for not being more investigative. Diligence to prevent
Correct.
Error, sure, but how about some diligence?
Whoa, that's not how this show works. we criticize you, you don't criticize us. You get your own podcast.
Somehow this turned into the Danny Dalros podcast.
This isn't your house, your mics. You don't get to use them.
I don't pay the bill.
Start criticizing.
Right. Don't affect our revenue stream. Yeah. Yeah. So I've heard people say things like, And for a while, I didn't know any better. I probably agreed. Maybe I disagreed. I don't remember. But people have said, like, well, I'm not going to, if it's not mentioned in the New Testament, then you're in a kind series of words, you're on thin ice at best. And that's safe. I think I'd said that earlier. You're safe to say that. But I think the opposite side of that same coin is like, well, you're not safe, right? Maybe you're discrediting, not intentionally, right? But
you're undershooting.
Yeah, it's like it does say study. We should search the scriptures to see whether those things.
I would. This is interesting because this kind of goes along with a podcast I did a long time ago with Josh Kennel. I don't know if you heard that one.
I did hear it.
You did. Okay. So Josh, and I disagree with Josh almost entirely on his interpretations. And I told him that on the podcast in no uncertain terms. I love Josh. I think he's great. I love Josh. Just disagree with him very much on his view of things. But one thing I think that Josh is really trying to do is he's trying to take the Old Testament seriously.
I remember you crediting him for that.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And I think that's definitely a lack from New Testament focused evangelical Christianity. I think New Testament focused evangelical Christianity, which I think I'm like I am your leader. I think that's a serious problem with us, is that we don't take the Old Testament seriously enough. And I know that most people would disagree with that assessment. They'd say, oh, no, I do. I listen to the sermons and I say, I don't think I do. I don't think I take it nearly seriously enough. And so I acknowledge that. And I appreciate of Josh that he thinks he's recognized that problem and he's trying to correct it. Now, I think he has super overcorrected it and he's tumbled the SUV down the highway, in my opinion. But I do appreciate that. And I think that are the same of you. I think you see the Old Testament more seriously than I do and take it more seriously than I do. Now, I can say I take it seriously, but, the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Right.
And I would say that out of every 3 billion New Testament sermons I preach, I might preach a half of one out of the Old Testament. So, how seriously do you really take it if you don't have a whole lot to say about it?
Right. Right. You wouldn't.
I asked a question recently on that virtual conference. I don't even know how it came up, but I asked a question to him on how did I phrase that? Oh yeah. So I asked him. I forget how it came up, but the question is this. So in my view, and I have I'm a very radical on this, on almost nothing else, but on this one point, I tend to radicalize. I've been radical.
They call him Old Mr. Mellow.
Oh, Mr. Mellow. Old Meller. I'm Old Meller.
I've never known him to be extreme about anything.
Anything at all. Zero.
Except
zero. Nothing. Zero. Nada. Zilch. Never extreme. Ever. Ever.
Absolutely not.
So, I'm a bit of the on the extreme side of this of the dating. So I date the New Testament to be written starting in about the year 49
or
48.
I thought you were talking about marriage again. Okay.
I have something about that.
Yeah, I have something about that too. But we got to make sure Terry's not watching the stream. We'll do that once we turn off the mics.
Pretty much rest assured, she's not. Neither is Laura. Neither is.
Yeah, no, nobody's watching. That's why I can just say anything I want to say.
So dating of this.
So the dating of the New Testament. I put the New Testament started to be written in the year 48, 49, which is Galatians. Now that's especially in academic circles. That's way. I mean, that's just ridiculous for them. They put it way late. You're talking about 10 years later maybe, minimum. And some of them put it even beyond the apostles, almost. There's few written by Paul, but Matthew, Mark, none of them were written by the apostles. It's all late. I put it written almost entirely before they even start, some of them.
Okay.
It's how I kind of date it. But here's the question. Let's assume I'm right. So let's assume that it's written in the year 49, and let's say that Christ, just assume he ascended in the year 33. Okay? So that then means 18 years. So what did they preach for 18 years? Right? You have 18 years of the church, not
Right.
pre-church or
Right.
however,
Right.
not 18 years of the church, including the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas going through the Gentile world, preaching to Gentiles. So you're way past any type of hyper dispensationalism, any correction that could lend you if you were to want to go that path. You're into Gentiles getting saved, right? What did they preach? And how did they do that? Imagine what we would do right now if we did not have the New Testament at all.
Right.
Well, I think our meetings would be real short. I would be like, well, let's go home.
That'd be a whole lot of type preaching going on.
Oh, there would, wouldn't there? Danny's like, yes, I knew I was born in the wrong
That's
millennia.
my ideal world you mentioned. I'm sorry.
Well, that's my point.
Your meetings might be short. Yeah.
My meetings would be very short. I mean, if I had to if I got up tomorrow morning to go preach and all of a sudden the New Testament didn't exist and everything that I had read, I couldn't quote, I didn't have it, it wasn't there. That'd be a tough little meeting. That'd be kind of tough.
I would not find it tough.
Well, I know.
I mean,
That's my point.
I mean, obviously, that's an impossible scenario to even begin to imagine. Right? You can't.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was their reality.
Yeah.
If your numbers are correct. So what do you think they did?
If my numbers aren't correct, it's worse.
They had it.
I'm putting them the New Testament being written 18 years after the ascension.
Right.
If my numbers aren't correct, it could be 20 or 30.
Right.
So it's actually even more.
So what do you think they did?
Well, I think that they preached a lot of the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they preached the truth that they knew, which is the essence of the new. This goes to my, and I don't know if anyone agrees with me on this, but I have a view of the Testaments that the Old Testament and the New Testament are very different books. I mean, extraordinarily different books. The Old Testament is the Old Testament. It is the book. That's the old, and by that I mean the Old Covenant. The covenant is the actual writing, right? Because it says, this is the covenant, and he says it's the 10 Commandments. That's the covenant that I've made with you. That's their covenant. The New Testament is not what we call the New Testament. The New Testament is something else. It's what's written in our hearts.
Right.
It's not the book.
Right.
The Old Covenant, it is the book. The book is it. The New Covenant, the New Testament, not the book.
So do you think they went back and, said like, remember the story of Jonah? Having known Christ, saw him die, saw him handled him like John said. Do you think they went back and said like, wow?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think they did. Especially at the beginning, I think they did exactly what Christ did with them after the crucifixion and the resurrection, which is to go back through, he says, the scriptures and prove that
They were talking about him.
And I think that they probably followed that pattern, at least, especially at the beginning, a lot of that, because we have examples of that where Stephen and Paul would go back through and recite the Old Testament history and bring it up and basically, update the history, right? Get it up to there and say, now here's the rest of the story, right? Which was kind of the way it happened. When we look at the genealogies, the genealogies kind of presage that, right? Where they go, okay, here they are, boom, 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 boom,
Yeah.
and now here's the next 10.
Yeah.
And then someone else says, well, here they are, Adam, blah, 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 and now here's 10 more. And I think that's kind of the pattern they would use with the
So what do
history.
you think they did with the gaps? With the incomplete pictures and
I don't know that
It's
they
all
were preaching
speculation,
types.
but-
Yeah, I don't know that they were preaching types. If we take Stephen and Paul's treatment in their sermons, it wasn't type preaching. It was that those events led to something. That those events demonstrated a preordination or demonstrated an interest by God in this series of events and they were going somewhere.
Right.
To say that God had no purpose would be, especially dealing with Jews, they would not accept such a
Correct.
premise, right? God had a purpose. What's the purpose? Well, they had always thought we're the purpose.
Right.
That's us. We're the purpose. And I think their point is, no, you weren't the purpose. You were merely the Jewish people are merely one more link
Yeah.
in this chain, and here's the purpose, the seed. The seed's the purpose, which is what Hebrews, just spells out, right?
Yeah.
Jesus is the seed.
He is everything.
He is it. It's not the Jewish people. It is him. He's the seed. And I think that's the type of teaching they were doing from the Old Testament mainly. I'm not sure they were doing what we would now think of as type preaching.
If you look at those few sermons, you have a strong point. But Jesus went beyond that. I mean, when he expounds, and so we don't know what he said.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're back to square one. Now we don't know how he exactly dealt with.
No, we don't. But the ones where we do know, it's not what we would now call type preaching. Now, here's an interesting thing I wanted to get your take on that. So Paul talks about there being patterns, which is the same word as types, right? He talks about the pattern, and he says their tabernacle is a pattern.
Yeah.
Of the time then present. Of that time, the time when it existed. That the tabernacle was a type of its own time, not of our time. Now, I'm not saying it isn't a type of our time. I'm saying that Paul looked at it and says that that the tabernacle was a type of the environment in which it was in, of the conditions. It was basically a what do they call those in teaching? They call them visual aids or object lesson, right? That says this object lesson. It represents the time in which it existed and the people and the everything that's intangible. You could look at the tabernacle and say, there lies the problem. Not, you understand what I'm saying?
This is not a slanted question at all.
No, they're not loaded whatsoever. So what are you going to do with that, Danny?
Well, to say that, because you're getting to the point where since we're no longer in that present, it doesn't really mean anything.
No, that's not my point. My point isn't that it doesn't have meaning today or can't be meaningful today. My point is that one problem I have with type preaching is it often overlooks that. The types are always of now and of us and of Christ at this moment or how it pertains. And Paul looks at the tabernacle and says, it's not only not of us, it's of its own time, which is kind of odd, right? You're like, we think of types as being very far reaching. It's like, here's this Adam, Jesus, God, this is a type that I often have heard before. God takes the rib out of Adam's side. Jesus is pierced in the side. Get it?
Yeah, taking a rib out is not the same as being pierced, right? But there is a wound.
There's a wound, and out of it comes a bride, and it's the type. And what Paul says, the tabernacle's a type. It's a type of the problems, the shortcomings, the deficiencies, the defective nature.
Right.
Fundamental nature of the law and it. So it's a type. God gave a object lesson and said, "Here's the problem with your whole religious structure. It can be seen with the deficiencies of this building. You can look at this building and you can see it's apropos. This building is apropos to the religious structure that it represents.
Even though the structure was given."
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's how Paul uses that type, which my point isn't that it can't be a type or it isn't a type of anything else or doesn't presage anything else. My point is that type of typology, hardly ever have I heard it taught. Even though that's actually the one Paul used in that way.
Like in a negative sense.
A negative and not being for us. It's not really
Right.
about us.
Right.
Right? This is about that. And Paul's saying you can look at this, we can examine the details of this building, how God wanted it. God was the architect of this building. We often think that was because he wanted to be this glorious, perfect thing. And what Paul's saying is, no, he actually said, I want you to make sure that it's built at scale of the flaws of your religious structure. So you can look at that and say, oh, we got some real problems.
Yeah.
If this represents that,
There's some problems.
there's some real problems.
Yeah. Not everybody gets in. Those that get in die.
Yeah, I mean, all of them. He goes through a number of them, and you're like,
God kills a couple.
I'm sure that somebody. I mean, if I knew somebody who liked to research these kind of things. I mean, if there were a person such as that,
Some young, energetic.
who could go through and say, wow, that's a crazy type, and go through and say, what are all the deficiencies in the tabernacle that are a type
No, I think
of the time then present.
yeah. I think that's because most types are usually presented in a positive, this is great. Boy, look at the consistency and not in a negative kind of way.
Well, that's usually what breaks them down, right? Is you come across anything that's not positive, and it's like, see, types aren't perfect.
Yeah. No, I would say that's a valid aspect or element teaching of that building. It's like there are some glorious things about that building. And then there are some things that are just like, well, that stinks. Like I can't get in. I got a crooked nose.
Yeah.
So I'm excluded because I got I didn't create my crooked nose. So I was like, how fair is that? Well, and you get into some real problems. But yeah, I think that's a valid understanding and consideration of if you're going to call it a type, which many people do. I do. Of course, here's another aspect of it. I said, okay, so you could approach it from that perspective, but it would be hard pressed to argue against the idea of like, in these real general terms. So when you get into the specifics, that's where you get in trouble. But people would say like, okay, so this tabernacle was where God dwelt. Okay. Yeah, but the heavens can't contain him, but his presence, at least part of it, was there. Okay, so in the times of Jesus, where was God present? Well, he was God manifest in the flesh. There he is. They didn't know it, but there he was. Well, where does the Lord dwell today? In the believer. So you could look at that building and talk about the religious structure and the problems of it, and it would be accurate. But then you could also say like, hey, is that building a picture of the Lord? Well, in the sense that God dwelt there, yeah. And I don't know. You could also, I heard this one last year. I don't think of these things. I'm not that smart. But one guy presented, and I'm still chewing on it. I'm like, it's interesting. But in the outer court, you had the brass altar and the laver where they would wash. Okay, well, that's kind of the summation, if you will, in general terms, of the Old Testament. Lots of sacrifices, lots of washings. You get inside the building, now you got the New Testament. You got this table where you can eat. You got this lampstand, which I think is like, people would say like, that's like the word of God or spirit of God. You got this incense, this altar of incense thing. Like generally people would say prayer and communion. And you didn't have that for most people in the Old Testament. That's kind of a New Testament perspective. And then you get beyond the veil and you get into like the very throne of God, heaven itself, if you will. And so he didn't divide it in, the guy divided it into like major dispensational divisions. And I'm like, well, that's interesting.
No, that is, I've heard that before.
I had not heard that until last year.
Oh, yeah, really?
Yep.
No, I've heard that before, that it represents that progression of revelation and experience with God, where you go from, washings and sacrifices, like you say, and then you go into more of
communion.
Or sacrifice, or not sacrifice, of service, or we might call it that, where you're offering prayers, but it's more of a personal thing, not with
Right.
not killing something else, but
Right.
you were offering things up or doing things to God and experiencing God. And then you get into the actual presence is inside.
Yeah, but the problem with that is the problem you expressed at the very beginning. That's not presented in the new. All you basically have in the new of the tabernacle is this insufficient,
Right. That's how Paul looks at it. That's exactly right.
So you're on that thin ice again. It's like, but I think you could look at the Bible as a whole and say, like, you know what? Very coincidental that it's kind of divided.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So could you preach it that way?
I couldn't personally. I wouldn't have a problem with you doing it, but I couldn't
Because
I don't want to go to hell. No.
We're not trash people.
I don't mind if you
I'm not
do.
a heretic. Hey, don't poke fun of my only weakness.
I know, right? Well, my problem is that I can't get away from how Paul uses it in Hebrews. Now, there is the element where he says that the veil represents the flesh of Christ. We've now gone within the veil.
Right.
And so there, he's in Hebrews, he does differentiate the tabernacle from the holiest place, which he uses to represent something else entirely. But that being very reserved, right? And that was the problem. There was I think what Paul is, one of the points Paul is making in Hebrews is that the real fundamental problem with the Old Testament is you didn't have access to the place you needed to actually get to.
Mm-hmm.
The place you needed to be at, you could not be at, right? And that's what that tabernacle typified of its present time.
Correct.
It had something you needed. There was a spot in there that was what you needed. You just couldn't be there.
Could not
be there. And that now Christ, through the veil, which is his flesh, has now given us all access to that place we all needed to be. But then that means we're not in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, you could not be there. The
Correct.
only way we're there is that somebody who could not have been a priest in the Old Testament gave us access to a place we could not get into.
Mm-hmm.
So everything about the New Testament is illegal. Everything about the New Testament, right, is like pirate, right? The guy who should not be a priest is taking people who should not go into a place none of them should ever be in.
See, you could preach that.
I could preach that.
Yeah.
But that's what Hebrews says. That's not like, that's no genius on my part whatsoever. That's just reading.
But you could go back into the Old Testament and say, like,
Oh, absolutely.
and look at the restrictions and look at the almost and like ridiculous. You mean just because the way my nose looks? Yeah.
Right.
Well, how fair is that? Fairness has not. You could preach.
See, I have no problem with any of
Yeah.
that, but to me, that's not tight preaching. Not how I look at when I'm critical, mildly, it's just itsy bitsy, teeny
in a
weeny,
constructive.
yeah,
kinda-
constructively critical of tight preaching. I'm not talking about that kind of a thing. I'm not talking about, I would say, pretty much everything I like. For instance, messages I've heard you speak. I'm not speaking of that. I'm talking about where basically doctrinal points are being made from these elements of stories. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Either you got that from the New Testament and are
Right.
pretending that you got it from over here and that it says it there when it really doesn't. You're just dragging it back over there.
What about?
Or you're just off base. What you looking for?
I was gonna. You know that story? Because I agree with you. It's this strange thing that we cannot go into the Old Testament and just dream things up, and we can't pretend to not be influenced by the New, right? We have this body of knowledge, and we're going to go read the Old Testament, and all of a sudden there's going to be like, oh, there's like that one story. This is in Exodus, and it's right before they come up with the golden calf. So they come to Aaron, and it's like the first two verses. I don't know, maybe Genesis 32.
Genesis, no. The golden calf,
I'm sorry.
Exodus.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry.
so the 20 would be the 10 Commandments.
Yeah. No, it's when they made the golden calf, but it's kind of. I thought it was 32. I know it's verses 1 and 2, at least one. But you'll know the expression.
Uh-huh.
They come to Aaron and they say, as for this Moses, we wot not is become of him. Something like that's a close. Are you looking at it? Yeah. That's it. Verse 1.
You had to go and use some knockoff Bible program. What's that garbage? This is the Freeborn podcast. This isn't the Nolan podcast. Go and use some knockoff Bible software garbage.
Yeah, so
in the NIV. Woo, you're just a rebel.
There it is.
Tell you what, man.
Oop, there it is. Oh, ice cream commercial. So I could look at that and I'm like, oh, here's a little snapshot, picture, example, type
Just gonna have to stick with that one.
of the New Testament.
Go to bible.freebornchurch.com.
It's good enough. It'll work. It's fine. Because it says like, we don't know what's happened to this Moses character. And then you have the story of the famed golden calf. So when I look at this, I'm like, okay, we have this people they're out of Egypt. They're no longer enslaved. They're not in the promised land. This interim time period, turned out to be a long interim time period. And they really don't know what their deliverer is doing. It's only been 40 days.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense to me. I mean, they see this mountain, and I guess that it's still lightning and thundering. Probably. And they're like, maybe he just got burned up. We're not quite sure. So they turn to idolatry. So in my mind, I'm like, what is the problem of the church? Well, if you look at Revelation 3 and Laodicea, it's very easy to see that Jesus is on the outside. And let's just be frank, right? 5 of the 7 are lousy as far as his testimony toward this church is concerned. And so I would make the connection that for the most part, if you ask the average Christian, what is Jesus doing today? What has he been doing the last 2,000 years? We spend a lot of time talking about his sacrifice, appropriately so, in selfish terms. Well, what he did for me was okay, but is it all about, is there no other elements or aspects of his crucifixion that is monumental? How about him pleasing his Father? No other man accomplished the Father's will like he did. Anyway, that's a kind of a side point. But we don't have this. I don't, anyways. And when I talk to people, I might ask them this question. I'm like, I don't know that people could go on and on as easily about what he's doing today as they could about what he did 2,000 years ago at Calvary. People can talk ad nauseum about his death and resurrection, but what about his intercessory role now? I look at that, I'm like, we're just not quite sure what he's doing. We don't know what's become of him. And so I look at this and I'm like, now, am I going to go that far to say, here's a little snapshot, a type of the church age, where we basically like the butler who forgot about Joseph. Now, I don't know if you see that, but when I read that, that's what comes to my mind. Like, the Lord was telling us a long time ago that we're basically going to forget about this great deliverance, or as Hebrews, this great salvation, and we're going to get in trouble by getting into idolatry. That's how I see that. I would call that a type. That's just one verse. But in my mind, I pull a lot of New Testament. I mean, when you read 1 Corinthians, it's like, did they do anything good? Well, after they kind of got straight in 2 Corinthians, but early on, they were a mess. Yeah. Right? And I'm like, Well, it's nothing new. This history of mankind has always been blotted and a train wreck from the beginning. You would think that they would be zealous, but they weren't. Well, now just put that right in our laps. We're pretty much, there hasn't been much of an evolution of the human heart.
Yeah.
That's how I see that verse.
Mm.
And I think that you could teach that, you could preach that. Again, you're going to bring a lot of new into the presentation.
Right.
Hard to say, like, oh, I just naturally saw this. I didn't need to know the New Testament because that's what the heart of man is. I knew what the heart of man was from Genesis 6, and nobody does that.
No, that's my point.
But I think it makes for, in my mind, really good teaching or preaching because
I think that it makes for very good illustrations.
if that's
And
what
that to me is how I look at a lot of what is done with types. And if it were presented as illustration, I would have with the caveat that they be accurate. But
right.
beyond that, I have no objection to good illustrations. And I think the Old Testament is a tremendous source of sermon illustration material. Not that that's all it is.
Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying there's nothing to learn there. I'm just saying that, as sermon illustration, you're looking for, I need a sermon. Well, Old Testament's a really good place just for illustrating sermons. But the problem I have is that too often times, I don't think types are presented that way. I think they're presented as being this doctrinal point that's being made without an explanation, at least that satisfies me that it's accurate.
So are you saying when you say a doctrinal point, are you saying that people make points that are absent in the New Testament? Certainly not contrary, because that's easy. But
well, there's a huge gulf between what's contrary and what simply is not spoken neither for nor against.
True.
And I think that a lot of types fall into that space.
The latter space.
Into that space between where you could say, hey, that's contrary, or the other side where it says, well, then it talks for it. It's like for and against, and in between is this huge space where most types funnel down into.
Okay.
It's that
All right.
safe space
Right.
where you're like, well, the New Testament doesn't say that. And the response is, well, it doesn't not say that either. Well, what does that mean?
15-15.
It means that between the outer ring where you're out of bounds and the inner ring when you're on target, that's the biggest place for all the arrows to land in.
Yeah.
And it's and the way that types are often done, it is in my view, in my perception, it is they want to give the air that they are hitting the target, that they are hitting what it says, but they want the safety, right, of not actually saying either for nor against.
I want to keep I was speaking allegorically card.
Oh yeah, exactly.
As a
Keep
trump.
the wand. Exactly. I was illustrating. It's like, that's not how it was presented, right? It's presented, and like I said, I've heard a lot of type preaching where I think is on that vein, where it's like, oh, I see this here, and they're presenting this, and it's all about that. And it's not saying the New Testament states this, and I see a vivid example of it here, because then that diminishes the cleverness of a type.
Yeah.
I know that not everyone who enjoys types is about that, but many are.
Right.
It's about that cleverness they had, that it's like a treasure. They found a hidden treasure that no one else could possibly find. It's like, what are you talking about? You got that from the New Testament. It was laying on the ground, and you went and buried it over there, and now you're pretending to dig it up. But most people are like, whoa, they're all amazed. They're like, where'd that come from? I'm like, what are you talking about? That's over there. It's right there. This is nothing. This is not buried treasure. This is faux treasure.
If presented as such, yeah.
Right.
So obviously, when they compiled the Bible, I mean, people thought, okay, you got to have this here. It's part of the grand scheme of things. Yeah. So if I think there's danger of undershooting and overshooting. And I think if someone's going to be serious about presenting this, and then at your house, you can think whatever you want to think. But if you're going to be presenting this as something that the Lord placed in Scripture to be discovered, and for the most part, we're not discovering anything new. Now, I'm not of the opinion that nothing is new. I'm not. I think that's like telling a little kid, well, nothing new is going to be discovered. Well, I think things like the internet have
Yeah, no.
or vaccines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, but the Bible is not like technology. Really? You think a book that reveals the mind of God is...
Well, see, I know this is a little different
restricted?
than what you're saying, but I have actually thought a little bit about this idea, this general concept, and I think that all that is old is now the new. All that is old is the new, because the actual meanings of the text is what nobody knows anymore. And now what's often preached is not what it's saying. We have wanted so badly to have something new to say that now if someone would just come out and say what's old, what it originally said, it would be like brand new. People would be like, what? Where did that come from?
I thought it was...
Yeah, we've heard so much new that what it actually is saying, and I'm not saying that could be all that can be said about it, but put it this way. I have asked so many people questions like this. I've gotten very few responses, usually no response. And I mean a lot of people. It's like, I'll ask them, what's the point of Ephesians? The reason the book was written, what's the point of Ephesians? Now, I'm not actually looking for the right answer. I'm just looking for an answer, right? Any answer. Right, if any answer, even if it's like way off base, but that they would have an answer. My experience with that question and similar ones is nobody has an answer.
You got a blank
Yeah,
stare?
they're like, and I'm not just talking about normal Christians. I mean pastors and preachers and teachers and all kinds of people. I've asked this question to. What's the point of 1 John? Why was 1 John written? What's the point? And that's an easy one. What's the point of Ephesians? What's the point of whichever book? Matthew. Why did Matthew write that gospel? What was he trying to communicate? What was his point? Now, people can disagree with me on the answers I would give,
right?
And I might disagree with them. That's not my point. Is most people have never thought about it.
Yeah.
They've never even considered that Ephesians might have a point. It's crazy. You would think that's absurd. How could that be? I never thought about it for years. I came to realize that I had no clue. It's like, I've never even thought about this. I just assume it doesn't have a point. Or that it's just like very scattered or whatever. So that's why I started saying, well, I want to go back and I want to try to figure out if they have a point. I don't assume they do. Maybe they don't. But if they do, and if they do, what would that point be? And I don't know that I've got the points right, but
right.
I find it interesting that so many people haven't even considered the question. So that's what I mean by, I think that anyone who come out and say, you know what, I'm just going to tell you what it's saying. Nothing fancy. I don't have any, this is why I think he's saying that, because he wrote this, and this is what he's trying to get across. It's just a simple point.
They're just going to walk through it like verse by verse.
I don't know why you got to say that. Verse by verse. I want to teach the Bible one fragment of a sentence at a time. One isolated.
That's two, Danny. That's calling her out.
Boy. Here we go, inviting Danny, thinking he's going to bring something to the table.
I'm trying to disqualify myself any further.
Like, how can I get uninvited?
Yeah, I heard a phrase one time. I had to admit that I didn't think of this, and it's a good question to ask. But I heard someone say one time that Ephesians, they talked about Ephesians as being the church of the Christ and Colossians as being the Christ of the church. And I thought, And whether that's right or wrong, again, is like, okay, that's aside.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, I don't know that I ever really conceptually thought of like, is there a major point? There's lots of subs, but is there a major? And I thought, I'm going to read the next time I read, I'm going to try to keep that in mind.
Mm.
And so I could see that. I see types as in the Old Testament kind of similar in the sense that there's this grandioso event that is, being played out in the lives of really many people, but primarily Israel as a nation. But there are supporting players as well, like these little sub pictures that mean something to the people at that time. But they also, because God's got this super giant, brain, that it's going to mean something to us later on as well. When we get down the road and when it's revealed to us, like, oh, here's how it ties in. Oh, look, there's a picture. He was like Jesus in Matthew. He was telling us plainly all along.
Yes.
I just didn't have, well, like you said, ears to hear.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I do think that we're going to find that the scriptures were far deeper than even we suspected they were.
Yeah.
Right.
I can't even imagine how advanced they
But
really
to me,
are.
that is a function, and I think we've talked about this before, but to me, that's a function of them being true.
Correct.
Right. The more than people say, well, because to me, at least for me, it's like I kind of squirmish about. I don't know if that's a word.
You squirm or you're
squirm
squeamish?
and I'm squeamish, so I'm squirmish. I'm squirmish. That's copyrighted. Copyrighted. If I hear anyone using that, I'm definitely gonna be suing. That's going in the dictionary, the Freeborn Dictionary.
If you use it enough.
Yeah, that's right. No, I'm a little squeamish of the idea, that God's preordaining all these events. To say that, I don't know. It's just there's a number of issues I have with that logically and philosophically, theologically. Number of issues of trying to put it that way. But to me, it's very easy to accept the idea that truth, by definition, is extremely, infinitely deep, and that something that is true is, like I said before, an author, let's say, of the New Testament, doesn't have to think, how can I make this fit every element of what's come before, what is preceded. All it has to be is true. And if it's true and everything that's preceded is true, then it's going to tie in ways that even the author could have never envisioned or imagined, simply because truth ties into itself. It's what we find in mathematics in a very visible way. Right? You can come up with a formula and have no clue how it could ever be used or how it could have a relationship to anything else. I was just watching some videos on some formulas and how they've been used now that nobody ever dreamed that could ever mean that, could ever, quantum stuff, how it could ever even have anything to do. And all of a sudden it's like this. What I was listening to, it was great. It was really interesting. I don't know if you don't know this or haven't seen, you ought to look up this video because it's crazy interesting for me. But it's how they figured out how they changed how they calculate pi. Have you ever heard that story? The way pi used to be calculated, not apple pie.
Right, no. We're talking about 22 divided by 7.
Yes. What? Danny breaking out the math.
Got my abacus.
That is pocket abacus. I'm very advanced. No, yeah, exactly. So what they used to do is they would take a circle and they divide it into polygons, and then they could just figure that out with doing that. But to get it more exact, you ended up with millions of polygons and it took like 25 years. The guy who broke the record and the last person to ever do it with that method was, whatever. Well, Newton, he's in the bubonic plague. Isaac Newton's in the bubonic plague, so he's quarantined. And he decides he's going to see if he can do it without the mechanical of actually dividing the circle into all these little polygons and calculating, each one that way. He's going to see if there isn't a formula. He takes this series of formulas that were developed long ago, and it's like a pyramid of numbers that repeat in a certain way. It's a pattern of numbers. And he has this insight, and he uses that and realizes he can use that pyramid of numbers that was like this. It's kind of like I forget what they call it, but it's kind of like the the Fibonacci type thing, you know. It isn't that one, but it's like that. It's like this repeating formula. And he says, what if I put negative numbers in that? And he does that, and it works. And he says, what if I apply that to pi? And I'm shortening the story, but he takes this thing that was just like this weird coincidence that numbers would do and they were arranged a certain way, and figures out you can now calculate any point of pi on its own. You don't have to go from 2 digits to 3. You can just say, I wonder what the 1 billionth digit of pi is. You can run that formula and it'll tell you what that one digit is without knowing any of the other digits.
Wow.
Just do that one. Incredible.
It is.
It is. Now, the guy that came up with that pyramid of numbers, you should look it up. What are you doing? I don't know. You're just sitting over there.
I'm listening.
He was so engrossed in the.
He's engrossed in the story. I kept thinking, type that in. Tell me what the number is. Put on there Newton pyramid pi. Maybe that'll give it to you.
Newton with a K, right?
Newton with a K. Canewton. He's the Canewton.
The only Newton he knows is fig.
He's trying to figure out. That's why he's engrossed. He's like, I don't understand how fig Newtons are a lot like pie. They taste like pie.
I've never wanted to calculate fig Newton.
No, not with a K, stupid.
It was on accident.
I typed in with a K. Oh my goodness.
It was on accident.
Okay, sure it was.
And you're gonna criticize types?
I don't know. Show with a K.
Newton, pi, P-I, and then a pyramid. Type in pyramid. I want to know what the name of that pyramid is.
I can't see the thing.
Yeah, you got to move your pyramid is with a Y. P-Y.
Yes, I know.
This is terrible.
Hold on.
The great producer.
We're gonna go to a couple of commercial breaks.
Yeah, we need where is that? That's the. I think that is the formula right there.
What am I? This one down here?
Try down there. It's Pi Day. See, if Mike was watching, let me see. If Mike is watching the podcast, he would know. Mike Pemberton would know that question.
He would.
He would. But interestingly, he's not watching. Everyone else in the world is. He's the one person not watching the podcast. No? I forget what it was.
Maybe he's in an interview. That'd be good.
Nah, they're talking about the Pyramid of Giza. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a number for it, and it's interesting. But my point there is somebody came up with something that was true. And because it was true, it links to other things that are true in ways that the guy who originally came up with had no clue that it was going to completely transform how we figured one of the most important pieces of mathematics that we have, which is pi. Very interesting. And I think that to me, I'm not saying it's the right way, but to me, that is a way that my logic will allow me to look at how the scriptures.
Your litmus test.
It's how I have a hard time looking at it the other way, where it's like it's not that I don't think that God can preordain things. I'm not convinced that that's his means and methods. Whereas I look at this and I think that to me is more logically acceptable. That Paul is writing truth and Peter's writing truth and Moses wrote truth. And as so long as all of it is true, it is going to link up in ways that none of them could have possibly
come up with on their own.
Right. Or that God ordained, it almost seems like it puts God as a schemer to my mind, where he's like doing this little cleverness behind there, as opposed to him revealing truth, and that it's just because it's true, it all ties in together. And in ways in which right now, even the most ardent typologists could figure out. It'll tie in ways we can't even imagine, couldn't possibly figure out.
Yeah. And I guess that's some of your reservations about types. And we just don't have, if you will, the technology, the brain power to figure out how these other apparent breakdowns of a type fit. I just can't do it.
Ha! He is watching. Mike says the Bermoulis Triangle.
I knew it.
I knew it.
Score.
He didn't let me down.
We don't even know if that's true or not.
Yeah, that's
just
the
making
thing
it
about
up.
Mike's information, right?
He's just
Mike
making up
says,
that
well, that's
word.
this and this. And you're like, okay,
Okay.
it must be. There's no way to know.
I can hear him saying right now, look.
We ought to call it the Pimberpedia.
Well, wasn't it? I don't know if it was you or Mike that told me, like some company, and I'm not going to have many details, but years ago, like decades probably, they invented the glass that now covers the iPhone. It's like a hard
Oh,
glass.
yeah, corny. Yeah, corny.
Yeah, but there
Gorilla
was
Glass.
like, yes, and it's like, okay,
yeah.
but there was no real like
Right, because it
mass,
was so expensive, you couldn't make windows out of it.
Right.
Right, and it wasn't useful for like cars because there you need a different type. You need glass that crumbles, not that won't break
Right,
very
right,
easily.
Right.
So, yeah, there was no application. They just
Right.
had this glass. Right. Yeah.
So then along comes the iPhone, and now
Yeah.
like, oh, and that dovetails together to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, because before then, cell phone displays were plastic.
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't break. I mean, if you think about how cell phones used to be before the iPhone, they were like indestructible.
The flip phones.
All of them, right? Especially the little candy bar phone.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember the candy bar?
Uh-huh.
They're indestructible. I mean, you could use them as a hammer, and they were just going to keep on working. They're incredible phones back then, and they had great range in the end because you had the antenna. Remember that? You'd pull out.
I still
you're like,
have.
you-
I still have our original cell phone that we bought.
and everyone was so pompous about that stupid antenna, right? Oh, I have a call. You're in there, you got this antenna sticking out there, and you're all superior. And then when you were done, it was like, I'm done. And you're like, pop it in, dink. You got the.
You weren't even sure if it was connected to anything.
Yeah,
right?
you're like, you couldn't. I tried. I had a phone. You don't pull the antenna out, sounds the same.
All right.
It's pure pompousness. It's like, no, I have a call. But yeah, they were all out of plastic.
And if you got too wild, you try to slide it in, it bend.
Yeah.
You try to hide it.
But then, when the iPhone, they wanted it to be capacitive touch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of the other way, they had touch screens, but they were the type of ones that you read like. They still make a few of them, and they're irritating because you're used to the iPhone type, and you got to really.
Get after it.
My dad, when he first got an iPhone, man, he was stabbing that thing. It won't work. He has anger management issues, I'll tell you right now. He was super angry.
Well, he also has big old sausage fingers, poking all kinds of things at once.
Yeah, so you're right. Yeah, and so the iPhone comes out and they need that, and then it works in, and they got that glass, and that no one had any, just there was no application for it until then. Now it's made them tons of money.
Tons
of money. Everyone needs it now.
Yeah.
It's on everything because you can't use plastic and get that touch. You have to have glass. It's conductive. Now, if anyone can come up with a plastics type material that's indestructible and would be capacitive, that would be.
You should work on that.
I'm already working on
Is
it.
that right?
While you're sleeping, I do things.
Oh, good. Talk about stealing my lines. Do you wonder why I got a patent copyright everything I say? These dummies steal all my lines. It's the name of my tool company. The name of my tool company is While You Were Sleeping. That's when I built them.
Oh, that's hilarious. What time is it?
It is 11:18.
Taco
All right.
time.
I just want to make sure that because we'll have to do some summarization and stuff like that. But I just get a real kick now out of types. I really do. I enjoy them. It's like it's in a sense it's no different than coming to grips, I guess, if you want to describe it that way, of like a New Testament truth. I mean, was there? I mean, just in my mind, I remember being amazed at really, when people would say stuff. I had no clue really if it was true or not. But I was just like, it was so quote unquote coincidental. But I think it would be like the New Testament stuff saying like, well, just forgive everybody. And you're like, what? You would never believe that it's true, that it was a positive thing until you actually did. And then you experientially say like, you know what? It is freeing. I'm not caring about vengeance and I'm not having ulcers because I just turned it over. I just forgive them.
See, we disagree on that.
How so? You don't disagree with that.
I do.
No, you do not.
I do. You apparently have never. Do I disagree with that?
If he says he disagrees with it,
No.
he disagrees with it.
It's like, have you ever you've come across New Testament phrases and verses and truths that were just like mind blowing?
Oh yeah, no, I disagree with your interpretation of forgiveness or your view of forgiveness.
Oh, I'm just saying. I
Okay.
may not be able to choose the right words, but it's just this like radical,
Right.
this revolutionary.
Yes.
It's like when Jesus taught. There are people like,
Well, it's a Sermon on the Mount.
what? Are you kidding me? You know?
The example I often use on that, and I think the entire New Testament is revolutionary.
Yes.
I think the entire New Testament is just like, what?
right.
I think-
it's the right word. Revolutionary is the right word.
Yeah. It's not perceived that way as much anymore because we live in it, right? We live in the culture and economy, and I mean that in its broadest sense, not finances
Yeah,
necessarily, but in its absolute broadest sense, kind of the way Bible teachers use the word economy, which is actually a biblical word, right? It comes from the Greek New Testament. We live in its economy, its culture, its reality that it created. And inside of it, it's easy to look at it with disdain. Not Christians, but just people who live in it. Atheists live in the economy of the New Testament and then dare to criticize it and to look down on it and dismiss it like silly stuff. Like, yeah, it's child's play because you live in it, right? You're submerged in its benefits.
Yeah, you don't know any better.
Yes, you have no clue what it is to live in a world that doesn't understand these points.
Correct.
Like the Sermon on the Mount. To me, the quintessential of what you're talking about is when Jesus gets up, Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." What? What? This, you go back and you look at history, you find a single time in history where not being a warrior, a conquering hero was good. There isn't.
Right.
The leader of every nation before then was the conquering hero. That is how you became Caesar.
Divide and conquer.
You had to be a conquering hero. That was, the parades were for the returning heroes, the conquerors, and now not at all. There is no Nobel War Prize. None, right? None. That we don't honor that. Where did that come from? That came from the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Jesus completely transformed the world.
Right. So I see that and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I see the Old Testament stories, these pictures, these shadows the same way.
Hmm.
I'm like, I mean, there's a lot of elements, like it speaks to consistency, but just as it's a little bit interesting, but just as surprising as Jesus was on the Sermon on the Mount, I would see a picture of Moses throwing down the tables of stone the first time. Like, I see that as the same. It's like the logical mind would be like, do you know how valuable those things were? I mean, with the finger. But there was a more important lesson to communicate. They had to be broken. And that's what it's like. When I heard it, I didn't see it. I probably was told this. No doubt I was told it. But I was like, oh, wow. That makes, again, it's hard to split the two because we live, like you said, in the knowledge of the new. We already know that we don't keep God's law. Yeah, but back then they didn't know that. if I tried to exclude the knowledge of the New Testament and only, it's impossible, right? I have to know that I'm a sinner and I break God's law. But to me, it was that fascinating. It was that like, and I could even use the word exciting. Like, what's going to happen next? Now what? 'Cause
Right.
we got a real problem now. And that's how I see them.
So here's that gone awry. Here is that same story, in my opinion, gone awry. Now, I may say this, and you'll be like, well, that's what I think. I'm like, awkward.
Well, it's already noon.
It's time to wrap it up. So I've heard taught, the teaching was that Moses then picked up those pieces and put those in the what do they call
Box, the ark?
Yeah, the ark. And that the blood covered the broken law.
No.
Well, I know, no. That's my point. but
Yes.
imagine how excited you would be if that were the case. I mean,
Yeah.
wouldn't that be just as beautiful type?
You could spin it that way.
Well, sure, that's my point.
Yeah.
And that's not what happened. There's no evidence of that. That's just concocted.
Yes.
Because it seems to line up with a perspective.
Because we've broken the law.
God's blood is covering the broken law.
Yeah.
It's like a perfect picture.
Yeah, it
It's like
is.
Moses, you dropped the ball. You had a perfect. To me, that's the problem with types right there. That exemplifies what the problem I have is that it can easily go way too far. In which,
Well, and the problem with that was they didn't go far enough.
well, you mean Moses did it?
No, the presenter.
Oh, how would he go any further?
You got to go find out the rest of the story. When there was no ark, the new tablets are created in like Deuteronomy chapter 10 or something like that, and I think that Moses actually built the box up on the mountain, or God built the thing, and that's where the law was put in there. So they didn't go far enough to tell the whole story.
No, exactly. They exactly. I see what you're saying. Yes, that's my point. But they had in their mind some view that could be meaningful.
Yes.
Like, here's a meaningful way of presenting this,
Yes.
right? And
Yep.
it doesn't matter if it's not biblical. Well, what does that matter? It's beautiful.
It's emotional. It'll make people
Yes,
feel good.
It makes a great point.
It would. It would.
Yeah, maybe. It just depends how you look at it. But and then I hear that, and that just sours me. I hear that kind of teaching is like, and so how do you not do that? And to me, that's hard.
Yeah.
I realize that's an extreme version.
No,
right?
but it's a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people I think really do believe that the tablets in it were broken.
Really?
Yeah, they really think they're broken.
That they use those.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
let's just gather up the like they did the manna, gather up the
Gather it
fragments.
all up.
That's another type that falls apart.
Oh,
It's
the
like-
manna? Oh, my
Yeah.
goodness. And who knew that it was about the open meeting?
Gosh. No, but once they get into we struggle with, I think, a misunderstanding of what Canaan is. And so when people say like, well, the man is the word of God. So the word of God stops when you get into your promised land. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, it depends what Canaan is then, right?
Right.
So if Canaan is, we'll say heaven, just to make it simple, well, then yeah, in a sense, I guess. I don't know.
So we run into these problems.
Well,
They fall apart, or then we have to backtrack.
Well, Canaan's a hard one.
It is.
What's that a type of? Well, that's been a lot of argument. I mean, what's the rest?
I don't see it as heaven. That's for sure.
What do you think the rest is in Hebrews?
I don't know that I'd be able to answer that off the top of my head. I know there remaineth therefore a rest. I can quote it,
Yeah.
but I don't know that I could put it. Oh, this is what the writer of Hebrews is talking. Because I've looked at that and I'm like, I've walked away with no answer. So what is it?
I think it's just simply that. I think it's not a type of anything. I think it's the rest that was promised to the Jewish people.
Is it Jewish?
Yeah, the Jewish people was promised to the Jews that they were going to have a national rest, a national salvation, a national repose
Is
from
that the-
enemies.
Is that the?
It's going to be brought about in the millennial reign, I think. I'm not much of a prophecy buff, so I don't much care about when exact or details. I'm going to really offend some people. I hardly ever do that. But I mean, I'm not sold on the ideas of the rapture or any of these other ideas. I'm very unconvinced of all of their prophetic outlooks of all branches of Christianity.
Yeah,
So
well,
I don't know. I have no like definition or saying it's this time, but I do believe in the broad schemes of prophecy, in that God has promised the Jewish people something. Now, I think that to me, that's the more interesting point is why they're getting their promises. See, I believe that God is under no obligation to them. He made a contract with them, the covenant, the old covenant. They broke it, and according to Hebrews, that covenant was done away with. So God has no bound. He's not bound to them to do anything for them. I think that it exemplifies his grace. That even though he doesn't owe them anything, right? He doesn't owe them a single thing because they broke the covenant and the covenant has been done away with. And there's a New Testament that doesn't promise them these things at all. He's still apparently going to fulfill those promises to them out of grace. And that promise is they are going to get a national repose from enmity, from danger, from whatever. And they're going to have a rule of righteousness, a reign of righteousness that Christ will head up. And that's what the rest is. And that remains to the people of God. I don't think it's actually symbolic of anything. I think it just is what it is.
Yeah. The only thing I've ever heard about that caused me to think about it is that the whole idea of Hebrews, most of Hebrews, is about, well, I'll say this. The sin of Hebrews has been said has been the sin of unbelief. And so maybe the rest was, belief.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I'm just saying that's what I heard. And
Yeah,
so
no. People misunderstand Hebrews for the same reason they misunderstand Ephesians, same reason they misunderstand John, and it's because they're not reading it as literature. They're reading it as verses. And I know people get tired of me saying that, but it's just the truth. They're looking at these little segments.
They don't get tired, Pop.
They don't?
They love it so much.
Yes.
What do you need? No one's bucking for something.
But they're reading it like these little segments of meaningful segments, that this little segment is meaningful in some way when it's not. It's not meaningful. Any more meaningful than chopping 10 words out of the middle of one of my sentences would be meaningful. And they're not reading it as literature in context and saying, how is this being developed? How is the argument being developed? And so then, therefore, every verse must become meaningful. That's my problem with the idea of verse by verse teaching, is they read a verse and they say, okay, I got to say something meaningful from this. Well, it might have something meaningful to say, but often it doesn't because you're in the middle of a sentence. I mean, Ephesians chapter 1 is like 2 sentences and 23 verses.
Right.
So is every verse meaningful? Probably not. Not by themselves, not independently.
Right. I mean, it's like...
Right? It wasn't written that way. But it's being read that way. I have a thing I put up. Nolan, put it... Oh, it's in Spanish. He can't read it. Never mind. I have a thing I wrote in English. And I put it up when I'm teaching this and explaining the problem. So I took a sentence and I divided it up into verses. I just wrote a sentence. And then I split it up into verses, put a number in front of each little paragraph, little segment, and capitalized the first letter. It's the only change I made. Has the same punctuation as it did as a paragraph. It's just divided into verses, and every first letter is capitalized. And I always put it up on when I'm teaching with the screen, I'll put it up and say, someone read it for me. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, they don't know what they're reading. They have no clue what they're saying. And then I simply change it back to a paragraph and say, now read it. And it's like, perfect, easy. Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, I get that. Now, you could have read it that way. You could train yourself to read the verses as if they weren't there. But it's very hard to do.
Well, there's a training.
Well, yeah. And we have 20 years plus of training to read it the other way.
Yeah, yeah.
To see paragraphs as paragraphs and capitalization means something. All of that's interpretive, right? That's all interpretation. Punctuation, capitalization, none of that was in any of the oldest manuscripts we have don't have any of that. So that's all been introduced as an interpretive tool to help us understand the text better. But it sure helps.
Yeah.
And to read against that is just crazy hard. People don't realize how difficult it is. They think I'm exaggerating. But that's my point in Hebrews, that people aren't reading Hebrews in any meaningful way is the problem.
Interesting.
And then you get the whole concept that, well, we can just symbolize things. We can make things symbolic, and we can find types, and this is going to be a type, and it's they run. See, another problem I have is people seem to run there first. Not everyone, but some people tend to run to types, to symbols, to shadows, to allegories, to analogies, to metaphors first.
Yeah, that's
instead of taking the simple, plain meaning first.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to what we said earlier. It's like, all right, so if you had to graph it, representation of how many allegories are there in the New Testament versus, and you would never do that then. You would walk away with a proper perspective. Well, I'll spend, maybe 2% of my time versus 90% of my time and one other thought I had about when you asked about guardrails and how can you avoid things. I don't know of anybody, and I don't know how practical this is, but who really studies in a group to avoid error?
Not very many Christians. It's kind of a Lone Ranger culture, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which I don't think is good.
It's not. And you would think with technology, it would be much easier than it was, and it is.
Well, sure.
I mean, I remember when I was in college, we used to meet together every morning, and we would
study
say,
groups.
"What did you read?" Or "What did you, what are you looking at?" And it had multiple advantages to doing that. But you could bounce something off of somebody, and they would be like, "What? Are you like crazy?" And it was a guardrail. It was a
Of course.
Yeah. But if you're left to yourself, even with study guides and material, you're still on your own, basically. I mean, you're going to be influenced by one person that you probably admire. So you're just kind of mimicking, and you're not getting objective feedback from somebody who differs, and that's a danger.
Well, most people don't want that kind of feedback.
True.
I mean, if I offer all the time to provide such feedback. I have a standing offer.
And it's free.
Yes, a standing offer. If you want someone to tell you that your ideas are garbage,
I'm the man.
I'm God's gift to you.
It's a gift.
It's a gift.
He gave some this, some that.
That's right. No, I mean, most people aren't interested in hearing from anybody who disagrees with them at all.
Right.
Not interested whatsoever. It's very interesting.
And that's a problem.
It is a problem. It's a huge problem.
And I think that could curb some of the the reservations that maybe you might have if someone.
Oh, absolutely.
If you knew somebody had gone through some type of rigor, some type of inspected, if you will, study, and come up with something that you never. Let's just face it. Not any of us have heard everything.
No, of course not.
But if someone shared something with you, and you'd be like, and you quite, how did you come up? It's like that question. I think it's in Galatians, right? When he talks about, did this persuasion come of him that called you? Right? It's like, where'd you get this idea, right? Did you have too much pizza one night? So I think longevity is something that's important as well. It's like, you got to chew on some stuff. You come up with this idea that says, I wonder if this narrative, I think you use that word, like this book, it was written with this intent. Boy, it just pays to, contemplate it, meditate upon it, study it, before I got this new idea. You got to spend maybe years thinking about some of these things before you say, I think this is whatever book is talking about.
Yeah, see, I don't know that many, especially the smaller churches. I think in the larger churches, you're going to find more of an academic culture in the pastorate. Where they're spending a lot of time preparing. When they do a series, it's all prepared before they start, and something they've worked on for a long time. I don't think you find that much in the smaller churches that you and I are accustomed to being in. Little Bible churches, little Baptist churches that are small. usually the pastors work,
Right.
right? So they don't have the time to put 40 hours a week into a sermon.
Right.
And that I don't think many of them have the culture of do it if they did have the time. I know when I was full-time missionary, I didn't do that. I didn't put 2 hours into a sermon. I mean, really.
Really?
No. Are you kidding me? No.
Man, I would just. I don't know. Maybe I'm just.
Have you always been that way, or is that a product of
It's a
some of
problem.
your?
I don't have any thoughts. None.
What do you mean you don't have any thoughts?
If someone's say
You mean off the top of your head thoughts?
any thoughts? None.
Now he tells me after we've already done a podcast, all the audience is like, this guy has no thoughts.
Like if my weekend is coming up, like when pre-pandemic, we had I had a once a month spot at the rescue mission, and it took me like all month to come up with something, just for a little.
What's your process of finding a sermon, coming to a sermon, preparing it? What's your process?
Hopefully, you're reading on a daily basis, and that's my go-to. I'm like, please give me something.
But when you're reading, how are you? Give me something. How do you? Is it something that jumps out at you? Is that what you're looking for? Or what do you do?
Sometimes, probably. Yeah, I just as I read these stories. Of course, I approach things differently because if I'm reading in the Old Testament, it's more of a story to me, as opposed to like Galatians, where it's like a letter. Like,
sure, it's an entirely different genre.
Right.
Yeah.
And so my approach to a story would be more like, who are the characters involved? What are they experiencing? What's their personalities like? Not to say that those things wouldn't be found in, say, the New Testament letters, but I think they play more of a role in the Old Testament. Like, have they been walking with the Lord in the Old Testament? Like a David would, or like a prophet would, versus because the apostles, well, yeah, they did. That's just kind of a given with their letters. They are, and so it's different. And the characters, some of them are like just evil. It's like you're dealing with the Jezebel, and I think, oh man, it looks like she came out of Nazareth, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, my approach is. So I think it depends upon, and of course, I know my audience. It's the rescue mission, which is a completely different audience.
Sure, that's a tough audience.
That's a tough gig. It really is.
Yeah.
So I try to read in the sense like what would capture their attention.
But what about when you preach at the church?
Well, I normally don't. First of all, which is fine. I'm not I'm not in the rotation.
But you do often.
No, not often. Usually, if I did, it would be like on a Sunday night or a Wednesday night. That's when I would speak. So it's not the traditional Sunday morning or type of.
We have a whole section on the website dedicated to you, the Danny Dalros whole section of teachings and preachings.
I know they need to take that down. It's like embarrassing.
But my point is, when you're looking for a sermon for that audience, what's your process?
Well, now it's study. Now I got to come up with some thought that's going to say, okay, what would a Sunday morning crowd need or be blessed by? And I'm generally outside the box a little bit because on a Sunday morning crowd, you hear a lot of gospel, which I think is right.
Sure, there's no problem with that.
But at the same time, it's like you've got a group of people there that, right or wrong, are not going to come Sunday night or Wednesday night. All right, so how are they being fed? How are they being ministered to by that designated meeting? So a lot of times I am not going to per se preach the gospel because I'm trying to, speak to that group. I want them to grow as a believer or be challenged as a believer. So I'll take stuff that has challenged. So in my reading, like usually I try to read some old, some new, and then I'll try to say, okay, so what would a New Testament church, how would a New Testament church benefit from what I've been reading over the last quarter? And so those are my thoughts. And I'm going to try to come across something that would be like, well, this spoke to me, and so maybe I'll chase that. It's very difficult. I'm not a, like, some people can just get up and speak. I was going to say ad nauseum, but I shouldn't say.
No, that's actually pretty accurate there.
But I'm just not. I'm not that type of a gifted. I mean, I remember.
I'm not sure that that's gift.
Well, I think some of it is. It's not always, but
I'm not going to say, I'm not speaking like without exception. So there could be some exceptions out there.
Yeah.
They're extremely, extremely, extremely rare, right? But in generalities, no, that's not a gift. That's just that's not even beneficial. I think that getting up and talking for 30 or 40 minutes about something you've put very little effort or research into is a very bad idea.
I would agree.
People would almost assuredly never do that in any other aspect of their life.
I would agree.
If
and
they were to be brought into a company that something they knew that was much, we're talking about, like, say they work at some company, insurance, and let's say, well, insurance is a whole lot simpler to figure out than the Bible, and metaphysical truth relating to eternity. Like, property insurance, much simpler, much easier.
Yeah, it is.
Right? They would not go into a presentation with the same level of preparation that they step into a pulpit with. And and I say this from someone, like I said, who did this for years like that. And I'm not bragging about it. I'm very embarrassed about that. That was incredibly foolish and disrespectful and irresponsible and sinful. So I'm not criticizing anyone per se other than myself. But the idea that there's someone out there that has this tremendous gift of the Spirit and they just speak and everything, no. That's, in my opinion, no. You can show me some exception and I'll accept it. That's fine. That's an exception. You're going to have to dig very far and very deep to find that exception.
Well, I know it wasn't me. So I had to study.
Right.
And I had to write things out and basically try to memorize what I had written in order to fill 30 minutes. It was very difficult.
Well, I have found that the more I prepare and the more I study and the more familiar I am with my subject, the less I have to say about it. The shorter time I can fill. It just, the less studied I am, the more verbose I am. And I have found that to be true of all sermons. When someone goes like an hour and a half, I'm like, well, that was one that they definitely had no idea what they were talking about. They assuredly did not put any effort into that one.
That's hilarious. Less studied, more verbose. Some people are like, what does verbose mean? Yeah, well, having had to speak for a living, and I've discovered tremendous value in study. Even in the latter years of working at USAA, I still studied lessons constantly, continuously. Not that I was unfamiliar with it, but there's always something that I was to learn or that I missed. Even I'm like, what? That's an update. No, it's been that way for a couple decades. Really? Nope.
Well, also it's a way of not becoming stale in your presentation. If you just fly on autopilot on what you've taught in the class, you say, well, these are new students. I've been teaching this for 10 years. They're hearing the same thing. They don't know that.
Right.
But there's a spirit that invades that type of approach that is staleness.
I also heard a guy say one time, and I can't quote him, and I don't know who it was, but I considered what he said, and I thought, there seems to be truth in what he said. And he said something to the effect that your preaching or your teaching is only as relevant or valid as your latest illustration. And his point was, if you're banking on illustrations from like decades ago, you're at a step.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I thought about that. I'm like, now that's not to say I think there are timeless. I mean, it's truth again. But I just considered that to be very good advice. If I don't have any, if I can't say just like yesterday or this past week or something like that, or I came across a story even last month, it was something about, well, it's like fresh manna.
Here we go.
That's great, Danny.
Here we go. 4.
Man is that type of the. That's true. Yeah, because to me, I used to describe it like the daily walk. I should be able to say that I was refreshed by something, that something happened in my life that, had a spiritual element to it. And if that's lacking or not even present at all, I'm like, well, something's wrong. It's like, you would not say like, well, yeah, I'm married. So when's the last time you saw your wife? A couple months ago.
Yeah.
And it's not occupationally connected, right? And so it's like, what? That seems a little off. And 99% of the people would agree with that.
Sure.
And so I think the scriptures are the same way. And so I think sermons, that's, and so if I had something happen like that, now I got to, and like to your point earlier, I don't want to say, take the experience and find a passage. I'm like, is the passage already there that speaks to the experience or the reality that I just had?
Right.
So that's the proper direction.
Right. So I prepared messages like that for a long. I've prepared messages in every way I can possibly imagine. I've read a lot of books on it, on homiletics and how to prepare sermons. And so I've tried a lot of different things. I've tried like they call the multiple perspective way, which is interesting, where and that works real good with narratives, right? Where you look at it and say, well, what does this passage look like through the eyes of this character that's in it? And what does it look like through the eyes of this character? So you look at it, they call that, and you do it at that. And I've tried that, and I've done a lot of those, and they're all fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with them per se. But like I was saying, I think that the old is the new. And so my thing now is, and this is just me, I'm not prescribing it to anyone, but my thing now is, I just want to try to understand what the author intended to say, his simple, direct meaning. Not saying there isn't any other, but I want to understand, what was he thinking? What was he attempting to communicate on this text, and just explain it. Just say, this is what it is, whether you knew it or not, whether it's meaningful to you or not, whether it helps you or not. This is what he's trying to say in 1 Peter. That's where I'm at right now in the church, is 1 Peter. So Peter wrote this epistle, and as far as I can tell, just by the simple, natural reading of the text, this is what he's trying to communicate. And, you'd say, well, I don't think that's helpful. And my response is, well, that speaks more of your problem than Peter's.
Right.
Here we have found the problem. We have identified the culprit.
That's why we're doing this.
And that helped me a great deal. I no longer am worried about whether or not it's helpful to anybody or meaningful to anybody. I'm just worried about, is this what the text says? So I just pick or go to the next one maybe, or, if you're going through, I just say I'm going to teach 1 Peter. And I'm not necessarily teaching verse by verse or paragraph by paragraph. I'm just saying, what is 1 Peter saying? And how can I break that into 4 or 5 or 2 or 3 things? Or maybe just one chapter. What's this paragraph teaching in 1 Peter? It doesn't have to be the whole book. And just explain it. And you say, where are you going with that? Well, I don't know. You have to ask Peter that. I'm just trying to explain to you what Peter is trying to say, so that when you read Peter, you have that knowledge, and you will then build on that. And there's probably a lot more. I know there's more. There's no doubt there's a lot more that you'll get out. But how could you get to that more, I see, if you don't even know what he's talking about to begin with?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at. That makes it much easier in the sense that I'm not like panic, or I'm just like, hey, if it's boring, go talk to Peter. Don't shoot the messenger.
Well, if the messenger is boring, you might want to differ a little. I'm not saying you got no magic tricks or deal with illusions, but
exactly.
Well, I do the same. I don't know. So back to, we're going to have to wrap this up.
Yeah.
But like the types thing, I find value in them, but I see danger in them as well. And I think if you're going at it alone, you're setting yourself up for problems, to be kind about it. Probably even potential error. And you got to saturate yourself with the truth that you know out of the New Testament. That's got to be a continual source of information, revelation, application. And then if you stumble across what you think to be a picture in the Old Testament of a New Testament reality, well, then everything should dovetail together. And then it's less about this this treasure that you've discovered, this revelation of the old, and it just simply becomes more of like a tale of God's consistency, this progressive revelation where he began to tell you about it like Jesus did, 10 times ago. And now with maturity and maybe some constructive feedback, now you're at a point of maturity where you can say, oh, now I see this picture from a long time ago that is a consistent message. You didn't discover anything.
Yeah.
There may be a different slant or a different perspective on it, but that's how I see them. And so to me, they're exciting to come across. But you have to temper it with, the New Testament perspective. Otherwise, you're in trouble. You're going to get in trouble. You're going to get off into some ditch somewhere, and maybe never get back.
Yeah.
It's hard to change what you pour yourself into.
Yeah, it is.
You work so hard.
Well, once you think you've seen something, especially if you've said it out loud, like in a meeting, if you preached it or taught it, and then to come back and say, yeah, that was a boneheaded thing to say. That's really hard to do.
Yes, it is.
Even for the most humble, that's very hard. We entrench ourselves.
And sometimes the damage is done. It's like when you say stuff and you're like, I'm sorry. Well, more mature people may say, okay, I've done that myself. And yeah, but what are you going to do for like young people who have now been influenced? And how are you going to undo that?
There's always someone in the audience. Preachers should think that there's always someone in the audience like me, like myself, that, most people in an audience don't hear anything that's being said. That's why I'm never very concerned with someone saying something wrong. It's like,
they're not listening to you.
No one's listening. I know people will get offended when I say that, but then I'll ask them, okay, what was the sermon about? They have no idea. It just happened 2 minutes ago. So no one's listening. But every now and then, there is somebody in the audience that's listening.
Yes.
And see, the way I was, and this is why it irritates me, so angers me when people say things that are informationally inaccurate, right? I'm not, there's room for there to be interpretation. People make mistakes. I make them all the time. Everybody does.
Yes.
But when it's just simple information that's inaccurate, there are people in the audience like me that not only hear it all and are really listening, they're really paying attention, but I extrapolated immediately from there. So you gave some piece of information that it's the broken tablets that are in that immediately goes, like fireworks. And it just like big chain effect, right? Immediately. And you got to remember there's people in the audience that are that way, and they're going to take what comment you make and they are going to run with that long and far. And you'll very quickly retract it, but they won't know. And or not, sometimes they'll know and not care. I mean, William Miller, I don't know if you know who William Miller is, but he's the guy that started all the Adventist groups and focus in evangelicism. He's the back in the 1800s that predicted the Lord was going to return. Everyone sold all their stuff. He was apparently very persuasive. All these Christians, there were no Adventists at the time or Jehovah's Witnesses. They're all offshoots of him. But all these Christians sold everything they had and went up on the mountains in white robes, waiting for the second coming. Of course, didn't happen. So he goes back and runs his calculations, comes back and says, I was off by a year. A bunch of them still go up in the mountain the next year,
Ugh.
doesn't come back. Well, then he comes out and says, I was wrong. My biblical math was just not, it's just wrong. He completely recanted. Very sincere man. From everything I can find about him, very sincere. He recants. The Adventists don't recant. They start the Adventist group. That's where they come from. The Jehovah Witnesses come from him. All these offshoots, these quasi or full-on heretical groups all come from him. He wasn't a heretic.
Wow.
They took his things and ran with them, and it didn't matter that he had come out and said, they're wrong. It's all wrong. I'm sorry, it's all wrong. Doesn't matter. You're going to have these zealots who are going to run with it, and they're going to take it far beyond anything you thought. That's why, I think Jesus is saying, be careful. Those of you that are going to teach, be careful.
Yeah.
Be very careful.
Yeah.
It's very serious business. And I know I didn't take it nearly seriously enough for a very long time.
Mm.
And who knows what harm I caused. I hope nobody was listening. Hopefully my sermons were like my podcast, in which case nothing went wrong. Nobody heard anything. Like if Michael speaks in the church.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
That is so funny. Oh, and one other thing I would conclude about types is that for the most part, I would say exalt the Lord Jesus.
Mm.
When I think of like the tabernacle, it wasn't like the outside that was attractive, but it was the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that matches up with his person.
Mm.
You looked at him and you're like, what? We think you're a carpenter and you're the son of this illegitimate. I mean, there was no flash or sensationalism. But you get in the inside of that building and your breath is taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Lord's personality, his thinking, his heart, that's the same way. And so types that talk about, like, even I said earlier that, the tabernacle, some people say it's a picture of the believer. I've never tried to go there. Never. True or not, because I'm like, I'm not even secondary.
Right.
I'm way down the totem pole list. And so if you're going to focus on the Lord, and again, all of this is backed up in the New Testament. You could talk about his heart with the way that he treated like the Syrophoenician woman. And you're like, nobody ever did that. Certainly no Jew did. And so you can make the points without having to go to a building. But the building kind of, in a sense, started that picture. It's on the inside. And you can back, it's like when he told David, when you're choosing David, oh, look at the heart, not the outside. And so you can find a string of truth. That fabric is being woven together till you get to the reality. You're like, oh, now we see. And I think some of the, things that people do when they try to find things like these concepts in Genesis or something like that and tie things together, I'm like, are they really exalting the Lord? Or are they more of like or more not?
Yeah.
And so I figure if I'm always focused on him, I got a pretty good chance of, and then if it doesn't fit, don't force it.
Yeah.
Right? If it doesn't just easily, not saying that things are always going to come easy, study is a good discipline to have. But yeah, if it doesn't magnify, exalt, increases excellency, I don't know that I would present it as a shadow.
Right.
A figure.
Well, very good. You got anything you want to add?
Nope. I covered everything.
We covered everything.
I don't think there's any words left to say.
Nope.
Types are bad. So we got Danny in, and he let us know that he agrees that types are wrong and bad. That's the gist that I got out of everything.
I failed in my calling in life.
All right. Well, thank you, Danny. We really appreciate you
Always a
coming
pleasure.
in. It is.
My pleasure.
It was so much fun. Next week, we will have...
Isn't it?
Linda?
No.
Isn't it Daniel Romero and...
Oh, yeah. Next week, we are going to talk about The Chosen. the TV show The Chosen. If you haven't seen it, then you hate Jesus. I don't know what else to say.
But love types.
You love types and hate Jesus because it's all about the life of Jesus. Greatest TV show ever made. I hate Christian movies, hate Christian shows, and this one is fabulous. It is fantastic. Anyways, we're going to have a whole talk on The Chosen, and we'll have a couple of people in to talk about it with us. So I hope you'll join us next week. And we have people lined up to be on the podcast. Basically, I just went and found the few people that listen and invited them in to speak. So no one will be listening. So I don't know who I'm talking to. But yeah, we got a bunch. In fact, in a couple weeks, I'll give you a little teaser. We are going to have a world-renowned economist coming in and talking to us. He's also a Christian, very outspoken Christian, but he's also a bona fide economist, which makes him like a god with a little g in my book, which I'm super, super excited about him. And I'll let you know more about that later. Anyway, thank you, Danny.